My sister leaned toward the photographer and lowered her voice, but not enough. Get one without her. Mom wants a picture she won't have to explain. My 13-year-old daughter heard every word. Lucy stepped out of the frame before I could move. It's okay, Mom, she whispered. Aunt Valerie says I should never get too comfortable anyway. I felt the room tilt. My father didn't. He turned slowly toward my sister, his face suddenly hard. What exactly have you been telling her? Valerie stopped smiling. Before I tell you what happened after that, I hope you're doing well, wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, because what I discovered about my daughter changed the way I understood the last few years of our lives. And if stories like ours mean something to you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined us again. A few hours earlier, I had been standing in Lucy's bedroom doorway, thinking how lucky I was that 13 had turned out to be easier than everyone had warned me. Late August in central Ohio had settled over the neighborhood like a damp blanket. The upstairs air conditioner was losing its argument with the heat, and Lucy had changed shirts 3 times, not because she was being dramatic about clothes, but because she kept worrying. Each one might draw the wrong kind of attention. The blue blouse was too bright. The white one, she decided, might look like she was trying too hard. She finally came downstairs in a soft green top and dark skirt and asked whether the necklace I had given her for her birthday was too much for a family picture. I remember smiling as I fastened the clasp for her. I told her it was a necklace, not a chandelier. She gave me a small laugh and touched the pendant with one finger. But a minute later, she asked again whether I was sure. At the time, I thought she was nervous, because family portraits made everyone a little strange. My mother treated photographs as if they were historical documents being prepared for a museum. My sister Valerie treated them like military operations. There would be an order, a schedule, preferred angles, backup combinations, and enough whispered instructions to make a person wonder whether we were commemorating an anniversary or negotiating a peace treaty. Lucy had been in our family long enough to know that. She had lived with me for 4 years and had been legally my daughter for 3. I had worked hard from the beginning to make sure adoption wasn't the headline attached to everything she did. She wasn't my adopted daughter when she made honor roll, or when she forgot her lunch, or when she left wet towels on the bathroom floor. She was Lucy. She was my kid. I believed that if I treated that as the most ordinary truth in the world, eventually, everyone else would stop treating it like something that required an explanation. That belief was one of the reasons I had trusted my family with her so completely. My job at the community college library was steady, but steady didn't always mean 9 to 5. At the start of semesters, during student events, or when someone called out, I occasionally worked late. For nearly 2 years, Mom and Valerie had been my backup. One of them might pick Lucy up from school on a Thursday, take her to dinner, or keep her for an hour while I finished an evening event. Sometimes Valerie took her along on errands. Sometimes Mom fed her before I arrived. Nothing about it had ever felt secretive. They were her aunt and grandmother. They had keys to the practical parts of our lives, in the way families often do emergency numbers, pickup permissions, the knowledge that Lucy hated mayonnaise and would pretend otherwise if she thought refusing it might inconvenience somebody. That afternoon, when we reached my parents' house, Valerie was already directing traffic. The photographer had set up near the large windows in the living room, where the late afternoon light softened everything it touched. My mother, Judith, had chosen the room because the neutral walls wouldn't compete with anyone's clothing. She had also moved 2 lamps, a side table, and 1 chair before we arrived, because apparently furniture could misbehave in photographs. Dad stood near the window in a jacket he claimed was trying to kill him. Lucy went straight to him and adjusted his collar, flattening one side that had folded underneath. Dad looked down at her hands and grumbled that at 76, a man had earned the right to look mysterious. Lucy laughed. Not the small, polite laugh she used when she wasn't sure what people expected, but a real one that showed the slight gap between her front teeth. Dad winked at me over her head, and for a moment the whole afternoon felt exactly like what I had wanted: a family event, in which Lucy was simply one more person fussing over Grandpa's tie. Valerie came past us holding her phone, checking something the photographer had asked about, and reminded me that she could still pick Lucy up from school the following Thursday if my late shift hadn't changed. I thanked her without thinking twice. Lucy heard the exchange and nodded, as if the plan had already been settled. There was nothing in Valerie's voice that made me uneasy, nothing in Lucy's face that made me stop. Looking back, that ordinary little exchange became almost unbearable to remember, because it showed exactly how easy access had been. I had never thought of it as access. I thought of it as family, helping family. Mom had a running list of which photographs she wanted. The two of them alone, one with both daughters, one with everyone, a few smaller combinations. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Judith Harper had spent most of her life perfecting the ability to make a preference sound like the obvious order of the universe. If she moved you 6 inches to the left, you moved. If she decided someone's sleeve looked rumpled, the sleeve got fixed. I had spent most of my childhood learning that it was easier to cooperate than ask why something mattered so much. Valerie had been the one who argued. I had been the one who made things easier. Maybe that was why I didn't notice at first how much Lucy did the same thing. Before the formal family shots, the photographer took a few test photographs and then several complete frames with all of us together. Lucy had been placed near Dad at first, but when Valerie suggested shifting people by height, Lucy immediately offered to move to the back. When the photographer reached for a narrow scarf that might add some texture to Lucy's green blouse, Lucy shook her head and said what she said about almost everything. "This is fine." There was nothing strange in the words by themselves. What stayed with me later was how quickly she said them. She never needed much. She never insisted. The shoes we had bought for the new school year had been the practical pair, even though I had seen her looking at another pair twice before putting them back. At restaurants, she chose from the cheaper half of the menu without appearing to calculate it. When I asked what she wanted for her birthday, she usually gave me 2 or 3 small possibilities, and then added that she didn't need any of them. I had taken pride in that. After everything she had been through before coming to me, I thought her lack of teenage entitlement was evidence that she felt secure. I thought I had gotten lucky. That sentence still hurts. Dad made a joke while the photographer adjusted us again, saying Lucy was more cooperative at 13 than Valerie had been at any age. A couple of people laughed. Valerie rolled her eyes with the ease of someone who had heard versions of that joke for 40 years. Lucy smiled too, but before the expression had fully formed, her eyes moved to me. Just for a second, she checked my face. I smiled back because I thought she wanted reassurance, that the joke was harmless. Once she saw me smiling, her shoulders loosened, and she smiled again. At the time, I read the moment as shyness. Later, I would understand that Lucy had been checking the emotional weather. The photographer took several full family pictures. I remember the camera shutter in quick bursts, Dad complaining about having to hold his smile, and Mom telling him under her breath that his face looked perfectly normal until he tried to smile for a camera. There was even a moment when Dad deliberately made an exaggerated, serious expression just to irritate her, and Lucy covered her mouth to keep from laughing, while the photographer lowered the camera and waited for us to settle down. Those few minutes mattered later. They meant there were already photographs of my daughter, standing exactly where she belonged, before anyone decided there should be another version. Then Valerie moved. The photographer had lowered the camera to review the last set. Mom was a few feet away, smoothing the front of her blouse, and asking whether the next picture should be arranged differently. Valerie stepped toward the photographer, as though she were simply helping coordinate the next grouping. Her voice dropped. "Not enough. Get one without her. Mom wants a picture she won't have to explain." I heard every word. So did Lucy. There are moments when your body understands danger before your mind names it. I remember my fingers going numb first. I remember the soft scrape of Lucy's shoe against the floor. What I do not remember is deciding to move, because I never got the chance. Lucy had already moved. No one touched her. No one pointed toward the hallway. Valerie didn't have to repeat herself. My daughter stepped neatly backward from the spot where the photographer had positioned her, then to the side, clearing the frame with the practiced efficiency of someone moving her chair so another person could pass. That was what frightened me most. She didn't look shocked. The photographer, seeing Valerie rearrange the group and assuming this was simply another requested combination, lifted the camera on instinct. The shutter clicked once. One photograph. Lucy outside the frame. The sound snapped something loose in me. I turned toward her, but Lucy was already looking at me with the expression she used whenever she thought I might be inconvenienced. "It's okay, Mom," she whispered. "Aunt Valerie says I should never get too comfortable anyway." The room changed. Dad's smile disappeared so completely, it was as if someone had wiped it from his face. He turned toward Valerie before I could get a word out. "What exactly have you been telling her?" Valerie stopped smiling. For perhaps 2 seconds, nobody moved. The photographer lowered the camera. My mother looked toward Valerie, not Lucy. That detail cut through the confusion more sharply than anything else. If Mom had been startled by what Valerie said, if she had been horrified that her name had been used that way, I expected her eyes to go to Lucy first. They didn't. Valerie recovered faster than the rest of us. She shifted the problem away from what she had said and toward the supposed awkwardness she had been trying to prevent. She claimed she was only saving Mom from having to explain a complicated family situation if the portrait was shown to people who didn't know us well. A complicated family situation. My daughter had been legally mine for 3 years. She lived in my house. Her school records carried my last name. She had a toothbrush beside mine and a favorite cereal nobody else was allowed to finish without replacing. Yet somehow, standing in my parents' living room, Valerie had reduced her to a detail that might require clarification. I looked at Mom. I asked her directly whether she had requested a photograph without Lucy. Mom's hand was still resting against the front of her blouse. Her fingers pressed into the fabric, creating 4 little creases. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. Instead, she said this was hardly the place to turn a photograph into a family dispute, and that people often took different versions of formal portraits. I had known my mother for 50 years. I knew the difference between Judith answering a question and Judith replacing one. Dad knew it too. His head turned slowly toward her. Mom kept talking, not much, just enough to make the omission louder. There were different combinations, different purposes. Not every photograph had to include every person. None of those statements actually answered what I had asked. Something cold traveled from the back of my neck down between my shoulders. If Valerie had invented Mom's request, Mom had just been handed the easiest possible opportunity to say so. She didn't. The photographer stood off to one side looking miserable, camera hanging from the strap against his chest. I felt sorry for him in an abstract way. He had been hired to photograph an anniversary, not walk into the middle of whatever this was. I also understood immediately that if I stayed in that room, the next 20 minutes would become an argument about wording. Valerie would say she hadn't meant it that way. Mom would talk about different photographs. Someone would point out that Lucy had already been included in several shots, as though belonging could be averaged across frames. I knew that dance because I had spent my life participating in it. One person did something hurtful. Another person objected. Then everyone debated whether the hurtful thing had been technically hurtful enough to justify making the room uncomfortable. I looked at Lucy. She had folded her hands in front of her skirt. Her chin was slightly tucked. She wasn't crying. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. She looked ready to wait quietly until the adults decided what happened to her. I crossed the room and put my hand against the middle of her back. I told the photographer we were done for the day. I didn't ask Mom whether she agreed. I didn't tell Valerie she was a terrible person. I didn't demand an apology, while Lucy stood there listening to adults debate the legitimacy of her place in the family. I just chose my daughter. Valerie followed us several steps toward the entryway. Her tone changed to the one she had used on me since we were young, the practical older sister, trying to stop Denise from making an emotional situation worse than necessary. Don't make this bigger than it is. That sentence had worked on me for decades. It had worked when Valerie forgot something and I objected. It had worked when Mom made some cutting remark and I wanted to leave dinner early. It had worked whenever my discomfort threatened the family's preference for moving on quickly. I was the reasonable one, the easy one, the person who could usually be counted on to absorb an injury if the alternative was making everyone else sit with it. My hand stayed on Lucy's back. I kept walking. Dad came after us as far as the front hall. He looked torn between following me and turning back toward Mom and Valerie. I could see the decision grinding through him. I told him to stay, not because what had happened was acceptable, but because the anniversary gathering was still sitting in pieces behind him, and right then Lucy needed fewer adults around her, not more. Dad nodded once. He touched Lucy lightly on the shoulder, careful enough that she could have moved away if she wanted to. She didn't. Then I took her home. The drive should have been 20 minutes. I remember almost none of the roads. I remember the air conditioning blowing too cold against my hands. I remember stopping at a red light and realizing I had been gripping the steering wheel so hard that my thumb hurt. Mostly, I remember how quiet Lucy was. I expected tears once we were alone. Instead, 5 minutes into the drive, she asked whether I was angry with her for ruining Grandpa's anniversary. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. Her eyes stayed on the passenger side window. The houses moved across the glass, then fields, then another strip of stores. She had tucked the necklace pendant underneath her blouse. I hadn't seen her do it. I told her she had ruined nothing. She nodded. That was all. A few miles later, she asked whether Grandpa was upset. I said Dad was upset about what had happened, not with her. Another nod. Then she asked if I had to explain her to people very often. The question came so quietly that I nearly missed it beneath the hum of the tires. I told her there was nothing about her I had to explain. She looked at me then, but not with relief. Her face had the careful concentration of someone trying to decide whether I had answered the question she had actually asked. I wanted to tell her Valerie was wrong. I wanted to fill the car with every promise I had ever made in my own head. I wanted to tell her that adoption was permanent, that she was my daughter, that nobody could vote her out of the family, because a photograph looks simpler without her. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she had stepped out of that frame before anyone instructed her to. Maybe it was how quickly she had blamed herself for the anniversary being ruined. Maybe it was the pendant hidden under her blouse. Whatever it was, I understood that this wasn't the moment to drown her in reassurance until she gave me the reaction I wanted. I had spent years telling Lucy she belonged. If those words had been enough by themselves, she would not have moved so quickly when Valerie asked for a picture without her. So I drove. When we got home, Lucy took off her shoes by the door and lined them up beside mine. She changed out of the green blouse almost immediately and folded it over the back of a chair instead of dropping it on the floor the way most 13-year-olds I knew would have. I went into the kitchen and put together something simple for us to eat, though neither of us seemed hungry. Lucy thanked me when I set a glass of water beside her. Thanked me for water from her own kitchen. The word landed differently than it ever had before. I sat across from her at the table and watched her break a cracker into smaller pieces without eating them. She looked tired now, but still controlled. Her eyes had gone slightly pink around the edges. I could have asked 20 questions. How many times had Valerie said something like that? When? Where? Had Mom said it too? Had Dad ever heard? Why hadn't Lucy told me? Those were adult questions. They were questions designed to build a case. The child sitting across from me didn't need to build one. I let the silence settle until it no longer felt like pressure. Then, I asked the only thing I needed to understand first. When Aunt Valerie tells you not to get too comfortable, What does she mean? Lucy's fingers stopped moving. She didn't look surprised that I had remembered the exact phrase. She looked worried that we were still talking about it. For a moment, she stared at the broken cracker pieces. Then she tried to make the whole thing smaller again. Valerie, she explained, only meant that Lucy should remember how lucky she was. Lucky. The word had followed Lucy through too many parts of her life. Lucky to be somewhere safe. Lucky someone had room. Lucky things were better now. Adults often meant kindness when they said it. I had used the word myself. That evening, it sounded different. Lucky I adopted you? Lucy's shoulders rose almost imperceptibly. Then nothing. She went so still that I could hear the refrigerator motor kick on behind me. I waited. The hardest thing I did that night was not fill the silence for her. Finally, Lucy rubbed her thumb across a crumb on the tabletop and told me what Valerie had apparently been telling her when I wasn't around. Not in the dramatic language an adult might use. Not as an accusation. She said it as if she were repeating a rule she had been given and had tried very hard to follow. Aunt Valerie said Grandma thought I loved her, but that I could still change my mind if she ever made things too hard. I didn't speak. Lucy kept her eyes on the table. My mother's face flashed through my mind at the portrait session. Her refusal to answer yes or no. Her insistence that this wasn't the place, the way she had talked about different versions of the photograph, rather than saying Valerie had lied. Until that moment, a small part of me had still been clinging to the possibility that my sister had used Mom's name to give one cruel comment more authority. Now I wasn't sure of anything. Except one thing. Whatever had happened to my daughter had not begun in front of that camera. The photograph had only been the first time I heard it. That thought stayed with me. After Lucy finished speaking, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, with the crumbs from one cracker gathered into a small pile beneath her fingertips, as if keeping the table neat had suddenly become the most important thing in the room. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the faint hum of the air conditioner. Outside, the last light of August had drained from the windows, turning the glass into dark mirrors. I could see the two of us reflected there, me sitting rigidly with both hands around a glass I hadn't touched, Lucy with her shoulders rounded slightly forward, waiting. I wanted dates. Places. Exact words. I wanted to know whether Valerie had said these things after school, in her car, at my parents' house, during one of the evenings I worked late. I wanted to know when my mother's name had first been attached to the idea that I might change my mind about my own daughter. Every instinct in me wanted to gather facts quickly enough to do something with them. But the more questions formed in my head, the smaller Lucy seemed to become. She had told me one thing, and already she was watching my face as though she needed to calculate the damage. So I let my hands loosen around the glass. I told her again, carefully, that she had not ruined Grandpa's anniversary. Nothing that happened at my parents' house was her fault. She wasn't going to lose privileges for telling me what Valerie had said, and she wasn't responsible for what the adults did with the truth afterward. Lucy nodded, but her eyes stayed on the table. It wasn't that bad. She said it the way someone might apologize for returning a shirt with a loose button, not denying what happened, just lowering its value. I could have argued with her. Instead, I asked what not that bad looked like. For the next few minutes, her answers came slowly, and often only after long spaces in which I had to fight the urge to rescue her from the silence. What frightened me was how ordinary the examples sounded when she repeated them. Valerie and Mom hadn't spent 2 years making explicit threats. They hadn't sat Lucy down and told her that one mistake would result in a social worker arriving with a suitcase. If they had, maybe she would have told me sooner. Maybe I would have recognized the danger faster. They had been smarter than that, whether they understood that about themselves or not. Their words sounded like advice. Lucy remembered being told that I had done more for her than most people would. She had heard variations of the idea that she shouldn't test how much patience people had. When she became upset about something, there had been reminders that children who appreciated having a good home didn't make everything about themselves. Those sentences could survive daylight. That was the ugly brilliance of them. Taken separately, each one could be defended. My mother could say she was teaching gratitude. Valerie could say she was encouraging respect. If I had overheard a single sentence without context, I might even have thought it clumsy rather than cruel. But Lucy hadn't heard one sentence. She had heard a system. I asked when they tended to say those things. Lucy shrugged at first. She didn't remember dates, because children rarely catalog ordinary afternoons according to a future investigation. She remembered circumstances instead. If she complained that she didn't like something, if she asked whether she could have something and was told no, if she got irritated, if she didn't answer quickly enough, if she was tired after school and sounded, in her words, kind of rude. Valerie was more likely to say something when they were alone in the car or running an errand. Mom usually delivered it with the calm certainty she brought to everything from table manners to weather forecasts. Neither woman needed to mention foster care directly. They knew enough of Lucy's history to know which words carried weight. Lucky, patient, appreciate, home. Those words should have been soft. In my daughter's head, someone had sharpened them. I asked her what she usually did after one of those conversations. Lucy looked confused by the question. Then she said, "I fix it." There was no drama in her voice. She might have been explaining what she did when a zipper got stuck. I waited, and eventually she described what fixing it meant. She apologized, stopped asking for whatever she had wanted, made herself quiet if she had been angry, and tried to compensate by becoming useful cleaning, carrying her own things, or deciding she could do without a ride, a snack, or money. If she felt sick but could still function, she often waited to see whether it passed before mentioning it. Valerie had never handed her a checklist. Lucy had built one herself from enough repeated reminders to conclude that being careful meant being easier to keep. I looked around the kitchen I had spent years trying to make ordinary for her. The chipped ceramic bowl by the sink, the magnet from the state fair holding up her school lunch calendar, her purple water bottle drying beside mine. All the evidence of permanence I thought I had created seemed suddenly less convincing than I had believed. A house could tell a child she belonged. Apparently, so could 100 small warnings tell her not to trust it. That night, after Lucy went upstairs to shower, I stayed at the table and found myself thinking about her 12th birthday. She had wanted a drawing tablet, not an expensive professional model, just a nicer beginner one she had shown me twice. Her face lit up when I asked if that was what she wanted. Then she caught herself and said it cost too much. By the next day, she had replaced the idea with a small set of markers. I remembered being proud of how sensible she was. Now I wondered whether she had stopped wanting the tablet at all, or only decided wanting it cost too much in a currency I had never seen her paying. When she came downstairs in pajamas, I did not ask about the tablet. We watched part of a baking show instead. At bedtime, she asked whether I was going to call Grandma, and when I said not that night, she studied my face before going upstairs. Earlier that summer, she had also turned down a sleepover, after first seeming excited. When I asked why, she had said, "I don't need to." At the time, I had respected the choice. Now the word need stayed with me. The next morning, messages from Valerie and Mom waited on my phone. Valerie wanted me to call when I was ready to be reasonable. Mom's preview complained about how upsetting the previous evening had been for Dad. I left both unread. Downstairs, Lucy had dressed for school before remembering it was Saturday. She apologized for the mistake, and when I made a light joke about nobody being removed from a family for putting on jeans a day early, she did not laugh. I changed the subject and made pancakes. Later, she opened the refrigerator and reached for the last strawberry yogurt, then put it back after glancing toward me. The movement brought back smaller versions of the same habit, checking before taking the last cookie, leaving a slice of pizza untouched, once asking Dad and me whether she could take an apple from my own fruit bowl. I had called it manners, and assumed old foster care habits simply took time to fade. Now I had to consider whether some of those habits had been reinforced instead of fading. I put the yogurt near her without comment, and she ate it while reading. Around noon, Dad called. Around noon, Dad called. His voice sounded older than it had the day before. He told me the anniversary gathering had ended shortly after Lucy and I left. A few people stayed long enough to help straighten the room, but nobody had much appetite for cake. Mom was furious that I had walked out. Valerie apparently thought I had humiliated everyone over one badly worded sentence. Dad didn't defend them. He also didn't pretend to understand everything yet. He told me he had never heard Lucy say she thought I might stop wanting her. He had never heard Valerie tell her not to get comfortable. He kept returning to that fact, as if it bothered him more each time he said it. Then he told me he was going to talk to Mom. I stopped him. Not forever. Not because Mom deserved protection. Because I still didn't know what Lucy needed from me, and I didn't want my father storming into a confrontation that would immediately send Valerie and Mom into defensive mode before I even understood what had been happening. Dad was quiet for a while. I could hear him breathing through his nose, the way he did when he disliked an answer but knew better than to argue with it. I told him the most useful thing he could do was not pressure Lucy, not ask her for details, and not become another adult waiting for her to prove what happened. He accepted that. Before we ended the call, he said he was sorry. Not for Mom, not for Valerie, for not having noticed. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Dad had sent a text. I am not mediating. I stared at it. Another message appeared almost immediately. Your mother says. Then, before I had time to respond, never mind. That was mediating. Despite everything, a small sound escaped me. Not quite a laugh, but close. Lucy looked up from the other end of the couch. I showed her only Dad's last two texts, without dragging her into the rest of the conversation. One corner of her mouth lifted. Grandpa's bad at this. For the first time since the portrait, something in the room loosened. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. I was grateful for every one of them. That afternoon, Lucy and I did ordinary things. Laundry. Grocery list. She complained that we were out of the crackers she liked, then immediately added that the other kind was fine. I almost told her she didn't have to keep saying that. I stopped myself. If I corrected every habit the moment I noticed it, I would turn normal life into another examination. Instead, I added her crackers to the list. Sometime after dinner, we returned to the conversation because Lucy brought it up herself. She wanted to know whether telling me what Valerie said meant I would stop letting Valerie pick her up from school. The question was practical on the surface. Underneath it sat the same fear as everything else. Consequences. Who loses whom, because Lucy spoke. I told her I hadn't made decisions about that yet. I also told her that whatever decisions I made would be mine, not something she had forced me into. Lucy picked at a loose thread near the cuff of her sweatshirt. Then she asked a question that made the kitchen seem to go silent around us. If she ever did something really bad, who would I call first? At first I thought she meant Dad or Valerie. Then she clarified. A social worker, maybe. Or the agency. She said it carefully, almost casually, but her eyes never left mine. 3 years had passed since the adoption was finalized. 3 years since I had sat beside Lucy while a judge signed the order that made permanent in law what had already become permanent in my heart. We had celebrated afterward with a lunch she barely ate, because she was too nervous, and a cake Dad accidentally carried sideways in the car. Lucy knew I was her mother. She knew what adoption meant in the broad sense. But somewhere inside her, another version of reality still existed. In that version, there was always a number I could call. A person who would come. A system waiting behind the curtain in case she finally became too much. I leaned my palms against the table because my hands had started trembling. I kept my answer simple. I told her there was no phone call I made, Because she got a bad grade, screamed at me, broke something, lied, or behaved badly. I was her legal parent. Problems between us would be handled the way parents handled problems with their children. A mistake did not reopen her adoption. I could see her listening. I could also see the words stop at a locked door. She nodded once. Okay, that was all. No sudden relief, no tears, no dramatic rush into my arms. Just okay. And I understood why. I had given her information. Her fear had years of experience behind it. Information was going to have to compete with experience for a while. That night, I stood outside her bedroom after she had gone to brush her teeth. The door was open. Her room looked almost exactly as it had for months. Bed made, desk clear, books lined neatly along one shelf. Too neatly, maybe. I had always thought she liked order. Now I wasn't sure what I was looking at anymore. I noticed how little of the room was difficult to remove. There were no posters taped across the walls, no shelves we had installed together, no collections sprawling across the dresser. The framed photograph from our trip to Lake Erie leaned against the wall instead of hanging from it, though I had offered to put in a nail more than once. I had interpreted all of that as preference. Lucy didn't like clutter. Lucy was practical. Lucy was mature. Lucy was easy. That word had begun to make me feel sick. I turned away and carried a stack of towels down the hall. Then I heard Lucy coming back. I stepped aside to let her pass, and that was when I saw the closet door standing open behind her. A dark blue duffel bag sat on the floor near the front. I recognized it vaguely. We had used it for short trips before, or at least I thought we had. What caught my attention wasn't the bag itself. It was where she kept it, not folded on the upper shelf, not pushed behind winter clothes, not empty, and flattened with the luggage. It sat upright, zipped, with the handles lying neatly across the top, ready to be lifted. My first thought was that she had packed it for a sleepover and forgotten to unpack. Then I remembered she hadn't gone to a sleepover. I took one step closer, not intending to touch it. Lucy moved before I did. She crossed the small space between us and positioned herself in front of the closet. The motion was quick enough to stop me. Her hand went behind her and pulled the closet door partly closed. It's nothing. I looked at her. The same child who had stepped out of a family photograph without being asked was now standing between me and an old duffel bag as though protecting something private. Every question I had learned not to ask all at once crowded behind my teeth. Was it packed? How long had it been there? What was inside? Why was it so easy to reach? I asked none of them. I told Lucy I wasn't going to touch it. Her shoulders lowered slightly. She closed the closet the rest of the way. I carried the towels downstairs. But the image followed me. The handles arranged on top, the zipper closed, the bag upright instead of stored away. For the first time, I was no longer only wondering what my mother and sister had said to my daughter when I wasn't there. I was beginning to see what Lucy had done with those words. And somewhere upstairs, behind a closed closet door, my 13-year-old daughter appeared to have kept herself ready for the day she might have to leave. The duffel bag stayed behind Lucy's closet door all night, and somehow knowing it was there changed the shape of the entire house. I didn't touch it. That mattered to me more than I could explain at the time. After Lucy went to bed, I passed her room twice, once to put away towels, and once because I had forgotten my phone downstairs and talked myself into checking the thermostat on the way back up. Both times, I noticed the closet door. Both times, I knew I could have opened it. I was her mother. If I had genuinely believed there was something dangerous inside, I would have had every right to look. But nothing about Lucy's reaction had suggested danger. She had looked protective, not guilty. Whatever was in that bag belonged to a part of her she had not offered me yet. For years, adults had decided where Lucy lived, what she carried, when she left, and how much of an explanation she deserved. I wasn't going to respond to the first frightening thing I discovered by proving that another adult could still open her belongings whenever fear made it convenient. So I went to bed. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the handles folded neatly across the top of the bag. Not tossed, not tangled. Ready. By morning, the late August humidity had fogged the lower corners of the kitchen windows. Lucy came downstairs in shorts and an old t-shirt, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked more tired than she had the day before, but she moved through breakfast the way she always did, quietly, efficiently, carrying her bowl to the sink before I had finished my coffee. She wiped one drop of milk from the counter with the side of her hand and then reached for a paper towel to clean the spot properly. I watched her do it and had to look down at my mug. 2 days earlier, I would have thought she was unusually responsible. Now, every helpful movement seemed to come with a question attached. Was this Lucy? Or was this Lucy making sure there was never anything about her that needed tolerating? I waited until breakfast was over. I didn't ask while she was eating because I didn't want the kitchen table to become a place where food and fear were tied together. When she headed upstairs to get dressed, I followed only as far as the hallway and told her I wanted to ask about the bag I had seen the night before. She froze halfway to her room. The first words out of her mouth were the ones I had started to dread. "Am I in trouble?" There was something about the speed of it that hurt more than if she had cried. I told her no. I told her I wasn't going to open the bag, and I wasn't asking her to show me anything she didn't want to show me. I had seen it. I was worried because of where it was and because of how quickly she had moved to hide it. If she wanted to explain, I would listen. If she wasn't ready, I would leave it alone. Lucy stood there for a few seconds, studying me. Then she went into her room. I stayed in the hallway until she looked back and gave a tiny nod. Only then did I follow. She opened the closet herself. The bag was exactly where I remembered it, upright near the front, positioned between a pair of shoes and a plastic bin of winter clothes. In daylight, it looked even more ordinary. Dark blue nylon, scuffed along one corner, a zipper that caught slightly near the end. It was the kind of bag half the families in America probably had shoved somewhere in a basement. Lucy crouched beside it. Her fingers rested on the zipper pull for a moment before she opened it. Nothing inside was dramatic. That almost made it worse. A few shirts were folded into tight rectangles. 2 pairs of jeans, underwear and socks tucked into one side pocket. A toothbrush sealed inside a sandwich bag. A phone charger wound carefully around itself. One paperback novel with a bent spine. A small stuffed keychain she had owned since before she came to me. Near the bottom was a photograph from the first summer we spent together, the 2 of us standing beside a lake, both squinting into the sun because Dad had insisted on taking the picture from the worst possible angle. I had expected, without admitting it to myself, to find some explanation that made the bag less frightening. Camping supplies, clothes she had forgotten after a trip, a half-finished attempt to organize her closet. Instead, everything inside had one thing in common. A person could carry it out of the house in one hand. Lucy sat back on her heels. I lowered myself to the carpet several feet away. I didn't reach for the bag. I didn't pull anything out. The open zipper already felt like more trust than I had earned that morning. I asked why she kept those things packed. She picked at a loose thread near the seam. Then she said, very quietly, "So you wouldn't have to pack for me if you ever decided I had to go." I looked down at the carpet because I could not let my face become another thing Lucy had to manage. The bag was not there because she planned to run away. It was there so I would not have to pack for her. Even in the future she feared most, she was trying not to inconvenience me. She had prepared to be abandoned politely. When I asked how long the bag had been packed, Lucy could not give me an exact answer. She thought she had begun keeping a few things together, not long after moving in with me. Clothes had been replaced as she grew. Chargers and books had changed. That was enough to tell me this was not a reaction to Valerie's recent comments. It was a system she had maintained. Lucy described it as practical. Earlier placements had taught her that endings could become hurried. Adults searched for socks, found boxes, decided what belonged to whom, and cars arrived. In one foster home, the adults had not been cruel. The placement simply became too much for them. What Lucy remembered was carrying some of her clothes to the car in a black trash bag. In another home, adults had begun talking about permanence before the pre-adoptive placement ended. Their reasons had been more complicated than a child could understand. But Lucy remembered adults becoming tired, conversations about whether things were working, and then another move. No one had told her she failed a test. She supplied that part herself. I knew the placement history from files and meetings. What I had missed was the lesson Lucy had carried forward. Adults could sound certain and later become less certain. By the time she came to me at 9, she was already studying the conditions of staying. Valerie's reminders landed on that history. To another 13-year-old, be grateful or don't push people might have sounded controlling. To Lucy, the words came attached to cars leaving driveways. I thought about the first year Lucy lived with me and how often people praised how little trouble she caused. She rarely argued about bedtime, helped before I finished asking, and seemed almost unnaturally easy. I had been relieved, even proud. The recognition pulled up one of my own childhood memories. When I was 11, Mom and Valerie argued through a school clothes trip. By the time Mom asked what I wanted, I chose the sweater she was already holding instead of the one I preferred. On the drive home, she praised me for being reasonable. I carried the word like a medal for years. Valerie pushed, I adjusted. Mom got tired. I became easier. My childhood had been secure in ways Lucy's was not. I had never believed my parents would send me away. But I knew what it meant to earn approval by requiring less, and somewhere along the way I had praised Lucy for doing the same thing. "You're so easy. You never make a fuss." I had meant those words lovingly. Now, I could see how they had helped me miss the fear underneath the behavior. Lucy was still sitting beside the open bag. She had begun refolding a shirt whose edge had come loose. I put my hand over the carpet between us, palm down, not touching her. I told her there were things she could do that would make me angry. There were things she could do that would have consequences. She could lie to me, break a rule, get a terrible grade because she refused to do the work, say something mean, make a mess, be furious with me. None of those things changed the relationship. You can be angry with me, you can break something, you can get a bad grade, you can tell me no. None of those things make you stop being my daughter. Lucy looked at me for a long time. Then, because she was 13, and because fear often searches for the edge of a promise, she tested it. What if I say something really mean? I almost smiled, but I didn't make the moment lighter than she needed it to be. I told her I might still send her to her room. I might be angry. She might have to apologize. If she broke something, we might replace it together. If she lied, trust would have to be rebuilt. But there would be breakfast the next morning. There would still be school pickup. Her room would still be her room. I would still be her mother. Lucy nodded. She did not throw herself into my arms. She did not cry and announce that everything made sense now. She looked back at the bag. Then she zipped it. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. She put it back in the closet. Not as close to the front as before, but she did not unpack it. That was where we were. I had given her a promise. She still needed the bag. Both things could be true. Later that afternoon, I tried to keep our routine ordinary. I made lunch. Lucy worked on a sketch at the kitchen table. I answered 2 work emails I had ignored since the portrait incident. Mom called once. I let it go to voicemail. Valerie sent a message asking whether I intended to drag this out all weekend. I didn't answer that either. The old Denise would have. The old Denise would have believed not answering was hostile. That day, silence felt less like avoidance and more like making room to think. While Lucy drew, I noticed her phone buzz twice beside her elbow. Each time, she glanced down and then turned the screen over. I asked whether the messages were from Valerie or Grandma. She hesitated. Then she nodded. I told her she did not have to show me her private conversations simply because I was upset. If there was something threatening or dangerous, I needed to know. Otherwise, they were still her messages. Lucy stared at the phone. After a while, she slid it across the table. "You can look," I asked if she was sure. She nodded again. I moved into the chair beside her rather than taking the phone away. The messages did not contain a confession or a direct threat. Most could have been defended one at a time. Reminders to be good for me, not add to my workload. Remember how lucky she was, or stop making small things into big ones. Their meaning became clearer only when Lucy told me what had happened before them. One followed a day she had asked Valerie to stop for art supplies, and looked disappointed when Valerie said no. That evening came a reminder about how much I already spent on her. Another followed a 5-minute argument Lucy and I had over her messy room. Afterward, Valerie warned her not to test my patience when I already did so much. A message from Mom came after Lucy said she disliked a dish at family dinner, reminding her that children who had been given stability should appreciate what was put in front of them. The messages clustered around ordinary behavior, wanting something, being annoyed, disagreeing, not liking food, leaving a room messy. They were fewer and softer nearly 2 years earlier, then became more frequent. Gratitude had started as a general principle and slowly become a correction. Lucy immediately reminded me that Grandma and Valerie had also been kind to her. Valerie bought lunch. Grandma helped with schoolwork. I believed her. That was part of why the pattern had been so easy to accept. The same people who cared for her could also make her feel that care had conditions. I asked Lucy whether she wanted me to screenshot anything. She looked nervous at the word. So I clarified that I wasn't planning to post messages, send them around, or make her conversations public. I only wanted a record of the specific exchanges that helped me understand what had been happening. After thinking about it, she agreed. I saved only a handful. Then I gave the phone back. She held it in both hands for a moment and asked whether I was going to talk to them. I said yes. Her fingers tightened around the case. Not both at once. Not with Lucy present. I had spent enough of my life watching family disagreements become competitions in which whoever spoke longest eventually exhausted everyone else. I was not going to put my daughter in a room with 2 adults and ask her to defend her own fear. I needed to start with the person who had said the words at the photograph, Valerie. She had been the one who told the photographer to remove Lucy. She had been the one who used, "Don't get too comfortable." Her messages were the most frequent, especially after Lucy displayed some small preference or frustration. If there was a method behind this, Valerie was where I would find it. I did not contact her immediately. First, I wrote down the facts. Not accusations. Facts. What Lucy had said at the portrait. The exact phrases she remembered. The bag. The messages and what had happened immediately before them. I did it because I knew my sister. Valerie could take a conversation that began with something she had done and turn it into a debate over somebody else's tone before you realized you had moved. She had been practicing since childhood. I also knew myself. I had spent 50 years softening the first sentence. Maybe you didn't mean it like that. I'm sure there's another explanation. I don't want to make this into something bigger. I could almost hear those phrases lining up in my head. I deleted them before they reached my mouth. By evening, I sent Valerie a short message asking to meet the next day without Lucy. I didn't list accusations. I didn't argue by text. I said we needed to talk about what she had been saying to my daughter, and that Lucy would not be part of the conversation. Valerie responded within minutes. For several seconds, I only saw the notification preview. Then I opened it. Good. Maybe we can finally talk without her making everything emotional. I read the sentence twice. Lucy was upstairs. The house around me was quiet. On the kitchen counter sat the grocery list she had written in her careful handwriting. Her crackers were underlined because we had forgotten them once already. On the refrigerator was the lunch calendar. Somewhere above me, behind a closet door, was a blue duffel bag containing everything my daughter believed I might one day need her to carry away. And Valerie thought Lucy was the person making this emotional. Until then, some part of me had still been trying to understand my sister's behavior as bad judgment, prejudice, cruel words used carelessly around a vulnerable child. That message changed the shape of the problem. Valerie did not see Lucy as the child who had been hurt. She saw Lucy's feelings as interference, something that made adult conversations harder, something to manage. I set the phone face down on the counter. For the first time since that camera shutter clicked, I was no longer only trying to understand what had happened. I was ready to ask my sister why she thought my daughter needed to be made easier to live with. Valerie's message stayed on my phone until I finally turned the screen face down. Good. Maybe we can finally talk without her making everything emotional. I had spent most of my life believing I knew my sister's worst habits. Valerie liked being right, and she could turn almost any disagreement into a question of whether everyone else was being reasonable enough. Over the years, she and Mom had developed the same vocabulary for inconvenient feelings: practical, sensible, realistic. Until that weekend, I had never understood what those words could sound like to a child who once carried her clothes between homes in a trash bag. That night I wrote down the facts I did not want Valerie to talk me out of. The portrait, don't get too comfortable, the messages Lucy had allowed me to save, and the bag. I did not photograph the bag or take it with me. It was Lucy's private emergency plan, not an exhibit. I also crossed out the soft openings that came naturally to me. Maybe you didn't mean it. I'm sure you thought you were helping. The next morning I told Lucy I was meeting Valerie without her. She was not going to rehearse what happened or sit through an adult debate about whether her fear was reasonable. Her first concern was whether Valerie would know she had shown me the messages. I reminded her that she had chosen what I could see and that Valerie's reaction belonged to Valerie. When I left, Lucy was sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, tense enough that I doubted she had read the page. The coffee shop Valerie chose was halfway between our houses, one of those suburban places designed to feel local while serving 3 kinds of milk nobody in our family had heard of when we were growing up. I arrived early and took a table near the back. I wanted somewhere public enough that nobody could turn the conversation into theater, but quiet enough that I didn't have to lower my voice every time I said Lucy's name. Valerie walked in exactly on time. She looked put together in a way that irritated me more than it should have. Hair smooth, purse over one shoulder, sunglasses pushed on top of her head. She ordered coffee before sitting down. I watched her thank the barista, move aside for another customer, and smile at an older man who held the door. Nothing about her looked dangerous. That was becoming an important lesson. People did not have to look cruel to do cruel things. Valerie sat across from me and began by framing the portrait incident as a misunderstanding that had grown because everybody was upset. She said the photographer had been confused about the combinations Mom wanted. Lucy had overheard part of a conversation, and I had reacted before anyone had the chance to explain. I let her finish. Then I asked whether she had ever told Lucy that I could change my mind about keeping her. Valerie's expression shifted by almost nothing. Her mouth tightened, then relaxed. I told her every family has limits. The answer was so carefully adjacent to the question that I knew immediately she had thought about this before. I had asked whether she had told my child I might stop being her mother. Valerie answered with a philosophy. I glanced at the notes on the table, then back at her. I asked what those limits had to do with Lucy being adopted. Valerie started explaining that I had always been too sensitive whenever anybody mentioned Lucy's past. According to her, I treated every reminder of reality as though it were a personal attack. She said children tested boundaries, and Lucy was no exception. The difference, in Valerie's view, was that Lucy had come into our family old enough to understand what had been done for her, and there was nothing wrong with expecting gratitude. The word sat between us. Gratitude. I had heard it from Lucy. I had seen it in the messages. Now I heard Valerie use it as though she were describing good table manners. I asked her what gratitude was supposed to look like. She gave me examples that were almost insultingly ordinary. Not arguing over purchases, not being rude when someone picked her up from school, remembering that I worked hard, not making every small disappointment into a bigger emotional issue. The details told me more than Valerie seemed to realize. She wasn't talking about serious misconduct, she was talking about adolescence, wanting something, getting irritated, complaining, having preferences. I asked whether she remembered sending Lucy messages after those moments. Valerie shrugged and said she had texted Lucy hundreds of times over the years. She wasn't going to pretend every reminder to behave was part of some sinister plan just because I had decided to use the word trauma. I hadn't used that word with her. The fact that she introduced it herself made me pause. I pulled the legal pad closer, but didn't read from it. I told her what I had been seeing since the portrait. Lucy asked permission to take food in her own home. She backed away from things she wanted because she worried about costing too much. She treated normal frustration like something that had to be corrected immediately. Valerie leaned back in her chair. Her first response was that some children were simply more conscientious than others. Then I told her about the bag. Not everything inside. I kept that part Lucy's. I told Valerie only what mattered. My daughter had kept clothing and basic belongings packed in a duffel bag because she believed there might come a day when I decided she had become too difficult to keep. Valerie looked genuinely startled for the first time since she sat down. The reaction lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she exhaled through her nose and looked toward the window. Then maybe she took it too far. I stared at her. There are sentences that reveal a person because they are carefully chosen. That one revealed Valerie because it wasn't. Her instinct was not to ask how long the bag had been packed, not to ask what Lucy had been afraid of, not even to deny contributing to that fear. Lucy had taken it too far. The child had mismanaged the lesson. I asked Valerie what lesson she thought Lucy was supposed to take from being reminded that I had chosen her. Valerie rubbed one thumb against the side of her coffee cup. She said I was twisting everything. No one had told Lucy to pack. No one had told her to expect a social worker. Valerie had simply tried to keep her from pushing boundaries in a house where I already gave her more freedom than Mom thought was wise. There it was again. Mom. I asked Valerie why she kept bringing Judith into it. This time she didn't hesitate. Mom thought I was too soft. Mom thought I was so afraid of making Lucy feel different that I refused to acknowledge she had come into the family with a history that mattered. Mom thought gratitude was healthy. According to Valerie, Judith had told her more than once that I should not let Lucy forget that bringing her into my home had started as a choice I made. The wording sent a chill through me. A choice. Every child comes into a family through choices made by adults. Pregnancy choices, marriage choices, custody choices, adoption choices. None of those things are supposed to become a monthly reminder that your membership can be reviewed. But to my mother, the original act of choosing Lucy had apparently remained part of the balance sheet. Valerie watched me absorb it and mistook my silence for uncertainty. She pushed further. She said Mom had been the one who wanted an additional version of the anniversary portrait without Lucy. Mom did not want every copy she displayed to lead to questions about who Lucy was, where she had come from, or why she didn't look like anybody else in the family. Valerie said she had only handled the arrangement because she had been organizing the photographer. That was the first time anyone had directly told me Mom had requested it. I did not immediately accept it as complete truth. Valerie was defending herself. People distribute responsibility differently when they are cornered. I knew my mother had refused to deny the request at the portrait, and that mattered. But I was not going to replace one assumption with another because Valerie had finally given me the answer that fit what I feared. I asked if Mom knew how Valerie had been talking to Lucy. Valerie gave me the same irritated look she used when she thought I was forcing her to repeat something obvious. Mom knew exactly what I meant. That answer I believed only as a claim from Valerie. I needed more. But even before I had it, the shape of the situation had changed. Valerie wasn't presenting herself as a rogue aunt who had gone too far. She was presenting herself as an enforcer of a family philosophy. I returned to the messages. I asked why the reminders so often appeared after Lucy behaved like an ordinary child. Valerie first denied there was any pattern, then described the same kinds of moments I had been noticing. Lucy sulking after being told no, complaining about chores, becoming moody during errands. In Valerie's view, those were the moments when a child needed perspective before bad habits settled in. When I asked what happened afterward, she admitted Lucy usually settled down. She stopped arguing, apologized, and sometimes decided she no longer needed whatever she had been asking for. Valerie treated that as proof the reminders were useful. I heard the pattern without naming it for her. Ordinary frustration went in. A quieter, more compliant Lucy came out. Valerie still framed the change as discipline, not fear. She insisted Lucy had always been sensitive about abandonment, and that sensitivity did not mean adults had to pretend actions had no consequences. I almost tried to explain the difference between consequences and making the relationship itself feel conditional. Then I remembered Lucy zipping the bag after I told her she would always be my daughter. I did not need Valerie to agree with me before I recognized the harm. I ended the meeting before it became the kind of circular argument Valerie preferred. I told her I would be contacting Mom separately, and that, until I had a clearer understanding of what had been said to Lucy, she was not to discuss the situation with her directly. Valerie started objecting before I stood up. She accused me of turning one child's fears into a family crisis, and warned that cutting people off would only make Lucy more insecure. I put my notebook in my purse. For years, that kind of accusation would have stopped me. If someone suggested my boundary might hurt another person, I usually stayed and reconsidered until the boundary disappeared. That morning, I left. The Ohio heat hit me as soon as I stepped outside. My car had been sitting in direct sun, and when I opened the door, the air inside smelled like hot fabric and the faint coffee I had spilled in the cup holder the week before. I stood beside it instead of getting in. My hands were shaking, not because Valerie had yelled. She hadn't. That was what made the entire conversation worse. Everything she had said came wrapped in calm language. Limits, gratitude, perspective, consequences. She could have delivered the same words at a parenting seminar and, stripped of Lucy's history, some of them might even have sounded reasonable. But I knew what happened after those words entered my daughter's head. She packed. My phone rang before I started the engine. Mom. I stared at her name until the call nearly went to voicemail. Then I answered. Judith did not waste much time. Valerie had clearly contacted her after I left the coffee shop because Mom already knew enough to accuse me of tearing the family apart over wording. She described the portrait as a badly handled photography request. She said Valerie's language had been unfortunate. She also made it clear she believed I was overreacting by treating every conversation about Lucy's behavior as evidence of prejudice. I listened. When Mom paused, I asked whether she had ever told Valerie that Lucy needed to be reminded I could change my mind. Silence. Not long enough. Mom rejected the wording rather than the idea. She said she had never told anyone I would abandon Lucy. Then she added the sentence that mattered. I said she should never take you for granted. I closed my eyes. Traffic moved through the parking lot in front of me. Someone pushed a cart toward the grocery store next door. A man walked past carrying 2 iced drinks. The normal world kept functioning while my mother confirmed that at least part of what Lucy had told me had come from exactly where she said it had. I asked what "take me for granted" meant for a legally adopted 13-year-old. Mom said children needed to understand sacrifice. She reminded me that I had rearranged my life, changed my schedule, spent money, and taken on responsibilities I had not been required to take on. She believed gratitude was not cruelty. There was that word again. I asked whether she used the same standard for Valerie and me when we were children. Mom said this was different. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. I already knew. Lucy had entered later. Therefore, somewhere in Mom's mind, the door she came through had never fully disappeared. I asked about the portrait. Mom went back to the argument about different versions. Families took photographs in different combinations all the time. It did not mean anyone was being erased. She said the portrait session had become ugly because I had chosen to turn a private preference into a public confrontation. She still did not directly tell me she had requested the No Lucy frame. Valerie had said she did. Mom still would not say she didn't. That was information too. I did not stay on the phone long enough for Mom to make me defend leaving the anniversary. I had already made one decision after talking to Valerie, and Mom's call made it necessary to expand it. I told her that, for now, neither she nor Valerie would be alone with Lucy. No school pickups. No rides. No private calls. No private texts. If either of them needed to communicate with Lucy, it would go through me until I decided otherwise. Mom's response changed immediately. Her voice lost the controlled patience she had been using. She accused me of punishing them by withholding a child they loved. She said I was allowing Lucy's fear to dictate adult relationships. She reminded me how often they had helped when I worked late, and how willingly they had stepped in when I needed family. That last part hit exactly where she meant it to. They had helped me. They had driven Lucy home, fed her dinner, picked her up from school, taken her on errands. I had trusted them because they had made my life easier. For a moment, guilt arrived before I could stop it. Then I pictured the same car rides from Lucy's side. The private conversations. The reminders after she expressed disappointment. The little corrections I never heard because I had been grateful someone else could get her home on Thursday. Help that required access did not purchase permanent rights to that access. I told Mom the boundary again, once. I did not debate it. She said I would regret dividing the family. I ended the call. I sat in my parked car afterward with both hands resting on the steering wheel and the engine still off. For the first time in days, the shaking stopped. Not because anything had been resolved. Nothing had. But the question had changed. I was no longer asking whether my mother and sister had said something inappropriate. They had. I was no longer asking whether Lucy had misunderstood every part of it. She hadn't. The problem was larger than individual phrases. Valerie believed fear could be useful if it produced good behavior. Mom believed Lucy's place in my life carried a debt she should continue remembering. Between those two ideas, my daughter had built herself into someone who apologized before anyone got angry. I drove home. Lucy was at the table sketching when I came in. She looked at my face immediately, but didn't ask how the conversation went. That restraint, which I had once admired, felt different now. I told her she was not going to be alone with Valerie or Grandma for a while. The pencil stopped. I made sure she understood this was my decision. She had not caused it by telling me the truth. She was not responsible for anybody's anger afterward. Lucy's gaze dropped to the sketchbook. She asked whether Grandma knew. I told her I had spoken to her. I did not give Lucy the details. A child should not have to carry adult defenses of why hurting her had supposedly been reasonable. She nodded once and returned to the drawing, though for several minutes the pencil barely moved. Later that evening, Valerie called. I almost let it ring out. Then I answered because I wanted no ambiguity about the boundary. I told her the same rules I had told Mom. No private messages. No pickups. No rides. No attempts to discuss the family conflict directly with Lucy. Valerie called it an overreaction. I did not respond to that word. She tried another route. She said I was teaching Lucy that people who challenged her could simply be removed from her life. She said I was reinforcing the very insecurity I claimed to be protecting her from. I told Valerie this was not about disagreement. It was about what she had done with access I had trusted her with. That was when her frustration finally stripped away the careful language she had used in the coffee shop. "You should be thanking me," she said. "She never gives you trouble, does she?" The sentence settled over me with terrible clarity. She never gives you trouble. Not she seems happier. Not she feels secure. Not she trusts you. Valerie's measure of success was how little difficulty Lucy created for the adults around her. The bag, the cheaper gifts, the food she asked permission to eat, the apologies that arrived before anger, the way she stepped out of a family photograph before anybody had to tell her twice. Those were not warning signs to Valerie. They were results. I ended the call soon after. That night, when I walked past Lucy's bedroom, the door was partly open. She was lying across the bed on her stomach drawing, one bare foot moving absently in the air. For a second, she looked exactly 13. Not adopted, not traumatized, not grateful, just 13. Then I noticed the closet. The blue duffel bag was still inside, zipped, waiting. I no longer needed to prove that Valerie had intended to frighten Lucy in some cartoonishly evil way. Intent was becoming almost beside the point. What frightened me now was something quieter. My mother and sister had created a world in which fear could be renamed discipline, silence could be renamed maturity, and a child making herself smaller could be praised as good behavior. And I was beginning to understand how many years I might have spent praising it too. By Monday morning, the boundary I had set had already begun changing the shape of my family. Valerie and Mom obeyed the part I could see. Neither of them texted Lucy directly. Neither tried to pick her up or call her. But silence did not mean acceptance. Dad called me late Sunday afternoon, and for once, did not begin by repeating everything my mother had said about me. He sounded tired enough that I could tell there had been hours of conversation in my parents' house, but he gave me only the part that mattered. Mom believed I was overreacting. Valerie believed I was punishing them. Both thought restricting contact would make the situation worse. Then Dad stopped. Normally, that would have been the point where he asked me to explain myself, so he could carry my explanation back across town and place it beside theirs. Our family had spent decades communicating through whoever happened to be least angry at the moment. Instead, he asked what I needed from him. I stood at my kitchen counter, with one hand resting beside a bowl of apples, and looked toward the living room. Lucy was curled into the corner of the couch, with her sketchbook balanced on her knees. Every few minutes, she glanced toward my phone. I told Dad one thing. Nobody was to pressure Lucy to apologize, forgive anyone, explain herself again, or attend some family meeting where adults could reassure themselves that everything was fine. Dad was quiet for a moment, then said he understood. I didn't spend 10 minutes convincing him. That was new. For most of my life, I had treated understanding as something I owed people before I was allowed to have a boundary. If someone disagreed, I explained more. If they still disagreed, I softened it. If they were hurt, I reconsidered. By the time everyone felt better, whatever I had originally needed had often disappeared. That weekend, I had no energy left for the old ritual. The boundary existed whether Mom liked my reasoning or not. What I had not expected was what happened inside my own head once the arguing stopped. Without Valerie calling, without Mom filling my voicemail, without another confrontation waiting every hour, I started remembering things. Not dramatic things. That was the problem. The memories coming back to me were ordinary enough that I had once considered them proof that Lucy was doing beautifully. The first one came while I was putting groceries away. I opened a kitchen drawer and found a small packet of watercolor pencils shoved behind a stack of takeout menus. They were cheap, half-used pencils from a school supply pack. Lucy had better ones upstairs now, but seeing them brought back an afternoon from the previous spring. She had joined an after-school art club, and one of the projects involved colored pencils that blended better than the basic classroom kind. She had shown me a set online one evening. It wasn't wildly expensive, but it was more than I would normally spend without thinking. I told her we could look at the budget after payday. Lucy had been excited enough to show me 2 comparison videos and explain, in far more detail than I needed, why one brand layered colors better. 2 days later, she told me to forget it. I remembered standing in almost the same spot in the kitchen, surprised by the change. She said the pencils weren't necessary. The school ones were fine. I had admired her maturity. That afternoon had also been one of the Thursdays Valerie picked her up, because I worked a student orientation event until almost 7. The connection had never occurred to me. One saved message from that week read, "Your mom already spends enough on you. You don't need to make every hobby expensive." Lucy had not asked Valerie to buy anything. She had asked me. By the next day, she no longer wanted the pencils. When I asked Lucy about it later, she admitted Valerie had made her think about me working extra hours while she sat at home asking for supplies. Mom's version was usually less direct, more about appreciation and not expecting too much. But Valerie turned those ideas into corrections during ordinary moments. I had praised Lucy for being thoughtful about money, without seeing what had made her retreat. That realization stayed with me through the rest of the morning. Lucy came into the kitchen around lunch and asked if she could make a sandwich. She still asked permission to use food in her own house, though after the last few days I had begun noticing how absurdly often she did it. I told her yes, then stopped myself from turning the moment into another lesson. If I announced every time she asked unnecessary permission, she would simply become anxious about asking permission wrong. So I let her make the sandwich. She used the last 2 slices of turkey and immediately checked the package, as though worried someone else had been counting. I added turkey to the grocery list. Small corrections, I was beginning to understand, would have to happen through repetition rather than speeches. That afternoon I asked Lucy about the art pencils, not why she had lied about wanting them, not whether Valerie made her change her mind. I simply told her I remembered how interested she had been and wondered what had happened. Lucy's knife stopped halfway through cutting her sandwich. She said she had realized they cost too much. I asked whether that realization had come before or after Valerie picked her up. Her eyes lowered. That was answer enough. Eventually, she told me Valerie had asked why she needed expensive art supplies when I already worked extra hours. The conversation hadn't lasted long. Valerie had not forbidden anything. She had simply made Lucy imagine me at work while she sat at home asking for pencils. Lucy decided she could use the school supplies. I asked whether Grandma ever said similar things. Sometimes. Mom's version was less direct. She talked more about appreciation and not expecting too much. Valerie was the one who turned those ideas into corrections during ordinary moments. Their roles finally became clear to me. Mom supplied the rule. Valerie applied it. Neither had to say, "If you cost Denise too much, she'll send you away." Lucy already carried the second half of the sentence inside her. I left the pencils where they were. I did not rush online and buy the expensive set that afternoon. That would have made me feel better, but it would not have changed the rule Lucy had learned. I wanted the next thing she asked for to be something she chose because she wanted it, not something I offered to prove a point. The second memory arrived the next day when I picked Lucy up from school. A group of students came through the doors ahead of her, loud and loose in the way kids often are when the school day finally releases them. Lucy walked behind them alone. She spotted my car, lifted one hand, and headed over. Watching her cross the parking lot reminded me of an incident from the previous year. A girl in one of her classes had made fun of the way Lucy pronounced a word during a presentation. It had spread into one of those stupid middle school jokes that seems enormous to the people involved and invisible to everyone else. Lucy had told me about it, only after I noticed she no longer wanted to practice presentations aloud. I had offered to contact the teacher. Lucy refused. She said the girl had stopped. A few weeks later, I learned from another parent that the teasing had continued longer than Lucy let on. When I asked her why she hadn't defended herself or told me sooner, she said she didn't want to make a scene. I had been proud of her restraint. I actually remembered telling Dad that Lucy was more mature than half the adults I knew. In the car that Tuesday, I asked if she remembered that situation. She did. She stared out the passenger window while I pulled away from the school. I asked whether Valerie had ever talked to her about it. Lucy rubbed her thumb along the edge of her backpack strap. Valerie had been the one who picked her up the afternoon after the worst of the teasing. Lucy had been angry enough to say she wanted to yell at the girl the next day. Valerie told her that children who made scenes were hard to keep around. Lucy repeated the phrase quietly, without emphasis. Kids who make scenes are hard to keep. The car seemed suddenly too small. I kept my eyes on the road. Lucy explained that Valerie probably hadn't meant anything serious. She thought Valerie was just telling her not to get in trouble at school. That was the interpretation Lucy had used to live with it. I could not. Valerie could have warned her about school consequences or told her to speak to a teacher. Instead, she had connected anger to being hard to keep. The next day, Lucy said nothing. The teacher eventually handled the problem after someone else reported it. I had praised my daughter for being mature without knowing what her restraint had cost. When we got home, Lucy went upstairs to change. I stood near the bottom of the stairs and looked toward her bedroom doorway. That brought back the third category of things I had misunderstood. Space. I had offered to repaint Lucy's room twice since the adoption became final. The first time, she said the pale gray walls were fine. The second time, I brought home paint samples because I thought having choices might help. Lucy looked at them politely, then left them stacked on her desk for weeks until I finally put them away. She had a few framed photographs, but most leaned against walls instead of hanging from them. A print she loved had remained rolled inside a tube for almost a year because she never asked me to put it up. She owned books, clothes, art supplies, ordinary teenage clutter, but even her clutter had limits. Everything could be collected quickly. Nothing claimed the walls. I had told myself she was minimalist. That word sounded ridiculous now. That evening, while she worked on homework at the dining table, I asked if there was a reason she had never wanted to hang the large print in her room. Lucy shrugged and said she just hadn't gotten around to it. I left the question alone. 10 minutes later, she closed her math book and told me there was something Valerie had said once. Not recently. A long time ago. She had been talking about decorating her room after seeing a friend's bedroom covered in photographs and lights. Valerie had told her it was smarter not to behave as though everything was permanent. Lucy repeated that part almost exactly. It's smarter not to act like everything is permanent. I did not have to ask what she heard underneath it. The untouched walls answered for her. So did the bag. Suddenly, the phrase from the portrait, "Don't get too comfortable," was not just an insult attached to one photograph. It had architecture. It had shaped a bedroom. I walked upstairs later and stood in the doorway without going in. The framed picture still leaned on the dresser. The blue duffel sat behind the closet door, and the walls were nearly bare. I had offered permanence in words, while Lucy kept avoiding the kinds of choices that left marks. That night, after dinner, I sat with her in the living room. We didn't turn on the television. The late summer rain had started tapping against the windows, soft at first, then hard enough to blur the streetlights. There was one question I had avoided because I didn't want it to sound like blame. I asked it anyway, gently. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lucy's face changed before she answered. Not guilt, fear of the answer itself. She tucked one leg beneath her and pulled the other knee close to her chest. For several seconds, I thought she might say she had been afraid Valerie or Grandma would be angry. Instead, she said, "Because they said you'd have to choose." The rain struck the windows harder. I didn't move. Lucy explained it in fragments, but the meaning became clear. Valerie had told her more than once that if she complained about family, she would put me in the middle. Mom had said family disagreements could make people choose sides, and that good children shouldn't make their parents fight with relatives. Neither woman had necessarily sat down and announced a coordinated threat. They didn't need to. They had given Lucy a picture. If she told me, I would confront them. If I confronted them, there would be a fight. If there was a fight, people would stop speaking. If people stopped speaking, the family would break. And Lucy would be the reason. She looked at me and said the part she had apparently been carrying alone for more than a year. I didn't want you to lose them because of me. My throat closed. Everything about the sentence was backward. Valerie and Mom had hurt Lucy. Lucy had protected them so I wouldn't lose them. She had taken responsibility for preserving the relationships of the adults, who were teaching her that her own relationship with me might not be permanent. I asked if she thought I would choose them over her. Lucy's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She said she didn't know. That answer hurt more than yes would have. A yes would have been a belief I could argue against. I don't know meant she had spent years collecting evidence on both sides. I told her the fight was not hers. Whatever happened between me, Mom, and Valerie was the result of adult choices. Telling me the truth did not create those choices. Lucy listened. Again, she did not give me the relief of looking instantly convinced. She had heard too many adults describe family conflict as something children caused by being difficult. Her body still seemed to expect consequences. I did not ask her to trust my words immediately. I sat beside her until the rain softened. Later that night, I found myself remembering my own childhood. Valerie and Mom had always fought more openly than I did. Dad escaped into the garage or yard when arguments became circular. I became useful. I cleared dishes, did homework without being reminded, and learned to postpone whatever I wanted when Mom already looked tired. One Christmas, when I was 14, Mom and Valerie argued through dinner about a party. I had planned to ask whether a friend could stay over that weekend. I never asked. Nobody told me I couldn't. I simply looked at the room and decided my need could wait. The next day, Mom thanked me for being the child she never had to worry about. I had carried that compliment for decades. Easy, reasonable, low maintenance. My childhood had been secure. I never believed my parents would send me away. Lucy did. The same habit I had used to keep peace had become, in her, a strategy for keeping a home. That was why her behavior had looked so virtuous to me for so long. For the first time since the portrait, I stopped wondering whether I had overreacted. That question had occupied far too much space in my head. Maybe I had left the anniversary too quickly. Maybe Valerie's wording had been clumsy. Maybe Mom's idea of gratitude was old-fashioned rather than malicious. Those distinctions could matter later if either woman ever became willing to take responsibility. They did not matter to the decision in front of me. My daughter was afraid that needing too much could cost her home. That was enough. The next morning, before work, I opened the school's parent portal. Judith and Valerie were still listed as approved emergency contacts and authorized pickup adults. Their names had been there so long I barely noticed them anymore. They represented convenience. Thursdays when I worked late. A flat tire. A student event that ran over. The kind of practical safety net I had once been grateful to have. I removed both names from pickup authorization. The portal allowed me to update some information directly, but I also called the school office to make sure the change was noted correctly. I kept the conversation brief. I was Lucy's legal parent. Family circumstances had changed. Unless I provided new authorization, neither woman was to pick her up. Nobody asked me for a dramatic explanation. No police report, no court order, no accusation. Just a parent changing permissions. That simplicity steadied me. I updated the emergency contact information too, replacing the family backup with another approved contact already available through my ordinary records. Then, I saved the confirmation. When Lucy came downstairs, I told her what I had done. She stopped near the kitchen island. I explained that Grandma and Valerie would not be picking her up from school for now. If my schedule ran late, I would make another arrangement. She did not have to watch for their cars, or wonder whether the boundary had changed without anyone telling her. Her first reaction was not relief. Of course it wasn't. Her face went pale. Are they going to hate me now? The question landed exactly where every other one had landed. Not, are they angry with you? Not, will Grandma apologize? Not, what happens next? Are they going to hate me? Lucy still measured every adult consequence by asking which relationship she had destroyed. I walked around the island but stopped before touching her. I told her this was my decision because I was her mother, and because adults who used private access to make her afraid did not automatically keep that access. She stared at the floor. I could see her trying to fit the information into the rules she already knew. If people lost access because she told the truth, then maybe telling the truth had caused the loss. I could say otherwise 100 times. She would need to watch what happened next. That was when I understood what protecting her was actually going to require. It was not enough to confront Valerie. It was not enough to prove Mom wrong. It was not enough to tell Lucy she belonged. I would have to show her, over and over, that adults could be angry without leaving, that a family could survive conflict without sacrificing the person who spoke, and that a boundary did not disappear just because keeping it made other people uncomfortable. Most of all, I would have to stop teaching the lesson I had spent my own life practicing. Keep the peace. Make yourself easier. Don't make things harder. Because Lucy had already learned that lesson better than I ever had. And if I wanted her to stop believing everyone would leave because of her, I was going to have to prove that sometimes the right thing to risk was the peace, not the child. For the next few days, the house became quieter in a way I had once thought I wanted. No messages from Valerie appeared on Lucy's phone. Mom did not call her. Nobody showed up at school. The pickup permissions held. I went to work, drove home, made dinner, checked homework, and tried not to turn every ordinary thing Lucy did into evidence of damage. That last part was harder than it sounded. Once you discover that a child has been measuring every need against the possibility of abandonment, it becomes tempting to examine everything. Every apology looks suspicious. Every clean plate becomes a question. Every closed door feels like a clue. I had to remind myself that Lucy was still 13. Sometimes she put her dishes in the sink because she was afraid of being difficult. Sometimes she put them there because I had asked her to. Sometimes a child was just putting away a plate. If I turned her entire personality into a trauma report, I would be taking something else away from her. So, I tried to watch less and be present more. The first real shift came when Dad asked if he could visit. He didn't phrase it as a family summit. He didn't say Mom wanted him to talk sense into me. He simply asked whether he could come by on Saturday and whether Lucy was comfortable with that. I asked her. She hesitated for a moment, then said Grandpa was okay. The wording caught me. Not I want to see Grandpa. Grandpa is okay. Even affection had become a safety category. Still, it was her answer, and I respected it. Dad arrived just after 10 carrying 2 grocery bags. I opened the door and stared at them. He looked down as though he had forgotten he was holding anything. I had told him during one of our phone calls not to show up with some oversized gift because he felt guilty. Lucy did not need proof of love in the form of something expensive enough to create another obligation. Dad cleared his throat and lifted one bag slightly. I wasn't sure if cereal counted as buying my way out of awkwardness. There was a box of Lucy's favorite cereal sticking out of the top beside bananas, milk, and a loaf of bread. I laughed before I could stop myself. Not much, just enough. From behind me, Lucy said, "Depends. Is it the good cereal?" Dad looked inside the bag as if checking evidence. "It was expensive enough to offend me." Lucy smiled. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but I felt something inside the house open a little. Dad set the groceries on the counter and did not reach for Lucy. That mattered. Normally he would have pulled her into a hug without thinking, because that was the kind of grandfather he had always been. This time he let her decide the distance. Lucy stayed near the kitchen island. Dad leaned both hands against the back of a chair. He looked uncomfortable. Good apologies often do. He didn't apologize for Mom. He didn't tell Lucy nobody had meant to hurt her. He didn't say he was sorry she had misunderstood anything. He looked directly at her. I should have asked more questions. That was all. Lucy immediately told him it was fine. Of course she did. The answer came so fast. Dad's eyes moved to me. I didn't say anything. He saw it. I think Dad finally heard the difference between forgiveness and reflex. Lucy began thanking him for the groceries. Then she thanked him for coming. Then she said again that Grandpa's anniversary wasn't supposed to have become such a problem. Dad's mouth tightened. He told her the anniversary was an adult problem, not hers, and that he had no intention of making her explain anything. Lucy nodded. A few minutes later, she asked whether he wanted coffee. My 13-year-old daughter was trying to host her grandfather through the aftermath of being excluded from his anniversary portrait. Dad shook his head slowly and told her he could survive 10 minutes without being taken care of. The line made Lucy look uncertain at first. Then Dad wandered toward the pantry and started putting away the cereal himself. Badly enough that she finally stepped in to tell him he had put it where the baking supplies went. That was the first half-normal disagreement I had seen between them since the portrait. I watched Lucy remove the cereal box from his hands and place it on the correct shelf. Dad let her. He did not turn it into a lesson. The three of us sat in the living room after that. But most of the serious conversation waited until Lucy went upstairs to work on a school project. Dad had changed in small ways over the previous week. He still looked like my father. Same faded polo shirt, same watch he had worn since I was in college, same habit of rubbing one thumb over the edge of the other hand when he was trying to organize his thoughts. But he was no longer speaking like a man who expected family tension to disappear if everyone lowered their voices. He told me he had been replaying years of little moments, not secrets, moments. Mom saying Lucy was lucky to have landed somewhere stable. Valerie saying I needed to give Lucy more structure, comments about how well-behaved she was, remarks about how children from difficult backgrounds needed consistency. Dad had heard pieces of it. He had not heard the worst phrases. He had never heard anyone say, I might change my mind. But he had heard enough language around gratitude and discipline that, looking back, he knew the subject had existed in front of him. He had dismissed it. His explanation was embarrassingly ordinary. Mom and Valerie handled more of the family logistics. They remembered birthdays. They coordinated rides. They organized dinners. They knew what everyone was bringing to Thanksgiving before Dad even knew Thanksgiving had become a scheduling problem. He had treated their interest in details like ownership of the entire category. If Mom said Lucy needed more structure, he assumed she had thought about it more than he had. If Valerie corrected something, he assumed she was being an aunt. If Lucy became quiet, he saw a quiet child. Dad had not consciously chosen to let anyone hurt her. He had chosen not to look closely. There was a difference. It was not as large a difference as he wanted it to be. I told him that. He nodded. I think part of him expected me to make it easier. I had spent years doing exactly that for him too. If Dad admitted a mistake, I usually rushed to explain why the mistake was understandable. This time I let it sit. Not knowing was different from not wanting to know. Dad looked toward the stairs. After a while, he said, I should have noticed more. I believed him. That did not erase anything. It simply meant he had reached a place where repair could begin. He stayed for lunch. Lucy remained almost painfully polite. She passed Dad the napkins before he asked. She cleared his plate. She offered him the last cookie. Dad looked at the cookie, then at me. I watched recognition move across his face. He pushed the plate back toward Lucy. He didn't make a speech. He simply said he had already had enough. Lucy waited a few seconds before taking it. That tiny hesitation told Dad more than anything I could have explained. After he left, I did not ask Lucy whether she thought the visit went well. She had spent enough of her life grading adults. I told her Grandpa seemed glad to see her. She said she was glad too. That was enough. Carol came into the story 2 days later. My aunt was 72, retired, and much less interested than Mom in making an ugly idea sound polite. She called me directly because she knew there was family conflict, but not the details. I gave her the short version, the portrait, the gratitude language, the messages, the pickup boundary, and finally the fact that Lucy had kept a bag packed in case I sent her away. Carol was quiet for a moment, then said, "Grateful children don't keep an escape bag." That was enough. She did not volunteer to confront anyone or turn herself into an investigator. She asked whether I needed anything practical, accepted no as an answer, and left the decision-making with me. Later that week, Dad told me Carol had stopped by my parents' house. Mom tried to frame my boundary as isolating Lucy and punishing the family. Carol asked one question. Had Mom actually denied telling Valerie that Lucy needed reminders about how lucky she was? When Mom shifted the subject, Carol chose not to stay and listened to Lucy's reaction, treated as the main problem. Dad noticed. More importantly, he changed his own behavior. He stopped carrying Mom's arguments to me, stopped asking me to make them easier to hear, and began making the person speaking to him own the conversation. For a man who had spent decades softening family conflict, that was a real change. A few days after Carol's visit, Dad called me in the evening. Lucy was upstairs showering. I had just started folding laundry at the dining table. The first thing I noticed was his voice. Not angry, flat. Dad said he had finally asked Mom the questions he should have asked at the beginning. I sat down. I did not know what the conversation between them had looked like. I was not there. Everything I learned came from what Dad chose to tell me afterward. He said he asked Mom whether Valerie had invented the language about Lucy needing reminders. Mom said no. She admitted she had told Valerie more than once that Lucy sometimes needed reminding that I was not obligated to tolerate everything. I stopped folding the shirt in my hands. The wording mattered. Not because it was the worst thing Mom could have said, because of what it implied. Parents are obligated to remain parents while dealing with difficult behavior. They can set rules, they can impose consequences, they can seek help. What they do not do is remind a child that the relationship itself exists by ongoing permission. Mom still did not seem to understand that distinction. Dad said she kept returning to the fact that I had chosen adoption, as if choosing my daughter remained different from becoming her mother, as if the original choice never completed itself. Dad asked whether Mom knew Valerie used those reminders when Lucy was upset, asked for things, or behaved badly. Mom did not claim ignorance. Dad told me, she said. Valerie probably used the reminders when Lucy needed them. Probably needed them. I closed my eyes. The phrase was so close to Valerie's own logic that for several seconds I heard my sister's voice instead of Mom's. Then Dad told me about the photograph. That was the last uncertainty I had been carrying. Valerie had told me Mom wanted the version without Lucy. Mom had refused to deny it. Still, until that moment, I had left a small door open in my mind. Maybe Valerie had taken a vague request and pushed it further. Maybe Mom had said she wanted different combinations, and Valerie chose who got removed. Maybe the ugliness belonged more to Valerie than Judith. Dad closed the door. Mom admitted to him that she had requested an anniversary portrait without Lucy. Her reason was exactly what Valerie had said. She wanted one photograph she could display or give to people without having to answer questions about the adoption. Dad repeated the explanation carefully, like he hated each word more as he said it. Mom did not consider the request exclusion. She considered it convenience. That distinction explained more about her than an apology ever could. Lucy's presence created questions. Questions made Mom uncomfortable. So instead of tolerating the discomfort, she removed the child from one frame. I sat at the dining table with one of Lucy's t-shirts still half folded in my hands. Dad said he had asked Mom what she thought Lucy was supposed to understand when she saw adults, treating her as something that complicated the family picture. Mom's answer, as Dad relayed it, returned to the same defense. She had never told Lucy she wasn't family. She had never told anyone to pack a bag. She had never told me to give Lucy back. Everything was measured against the most extreme sentence she had not said. That allowed her to ignore the meaning of all the sentences she had. Dad told me he finally said he would not ask me to bring Lucy over. He would not pressure me to get past it. He would not tell Lucy to accept an apology that had not happened. Mom apparently accused him of choosing me over his wife. Dad did not give me the details after that. I didn't need them. The important thing was what he did next. He stayed out of the middle. He was calling me to give me information I had a right to know, not to negotiate a reunion. This time, Dad was not asking me to make peace easier for him. I looked toward the stairs. Lucy's shower had stopped. I lowered my voice. I told Dad I appreciated him telling me. I did not tell him what to do with his marriage. That was his responsibility. Then I asked one question. Did Mom understand that Valerie had been using fear because it changed Lucy's behavior? Dad was quiet. He said he didn't know whether Mom would describe it that way. But she knew Valerie gave those reminders after Lucy had been difficult, disappointed, angry, or demanding. She approved because she believed they improved Lucy's behavior. That was enough. Not because it proved Mom sat down and designed a psychological strategy. She hadn't. The truth was more ordinary, and, in some ways, worse. They had discovered something that worked. Lucy became quieter. She stopped asking. She apologized. She made herself easier. And because the adults benefited, nobody asked what the obedience cost her. After the call ended, I stayed at the table. The laundry sat in uneven piles around me. For days, I had been separating Mom and Valerie in my head. Valerie was the one who weaponized the fear. Mom was the source of the worldview. Valerie pushed. Mom justified. I had hoped that distinction might contain one small mercy. Maybe Mom had been careless. Maybe Valerie had taken an old woman's ugly assumptions and turned them into something deliberate without her fully understanding. Dad had just taken that hope away. Mom knew the reminders were being used. She knew when. She knew the result. She approved. And she had personally asked for the photograph that pushed Lucy out of the frame. I heard Lucy's bedroom door open upstairs. A moment later, she came down wearing pajama pants and an oversized t-shirt, rubbing a towel over the ends of her hair. She saw the laundry. Without thinking, she reached for a stack. I almost told her not to help. Then I caught myself. Helping with laundry was not automatically fear. I handed her a pile of socks. She sat across from me. For several minutes, we matched pairs without talking. That was the kind of ordinary moment I wanted to protect. Not perfect silence, not perfect behavior, just two people folding laundry because laundry existed. Lucy eventually asked whether Grandpa had called. I told her yes. She waited. I could see the question in the way her hands slowed. I did not tell her everything. She did not need Mom's defense repeated inside her head. I told her Grandpa had asked questions and learned enough to understand that what happened was not a misunderstanding. Lucy looked down at the socks. I told her something else. Grandpa was not asking her to visit. He was not asking her to forgive anyone. He was not asking me to bring her back to the house. Lucy's shoulders loosened slightly. That reaction told me exactly how much pressure she had expected. She asked if Grandpa was mad at Grandma. I said whatever happened between them belonged to them. For once, Lucy did not have to manage it. She nodded. Then she paired two socks that did not match and stared at them as if they had personally betrayed her. I pointed it out. She looked at the socks, then at me. I was testing you. It was so dry and so unexpected that I laughed. Lucy smiled. For a few seconds, neither of us talked about family. We argued about whether two different shades of gray counted as a matching pair. I let her win. Not because she needed to, because one of the socks had a stripe I had somehow missed. Later, after Lucy went to bed, I stood at the bottom of the stairs and thought about the confrontation I knew was coming. Not tomorrow. Not with Lucy. That much was clear. I would not bring my daughter into a room and ask her to describe the bag so two adults could decide whether her fear was reasonable enough to deserve an apology. She would not be evidence. She would not sit across from Mom and Valerie while they explained what they had meant. If there was another confrontation, it would be between adults. I would carry the facts. Lucy would keep her right to stay out of it. Until Dad's call, part of me had still been asking whether Mom knew. That question was finished. She knew Valerie used the reminders. She knew they followed moments when Lucy behaved like an ordinary child. She approved because the child became easier afterward. And the photograph had been Mom's request. The only question left was what would happen when neither woman could hide behind wording anymore. When they had to look directly at the child who kept a bag packed, the bedrooms she refused to claim, the things she stopped asking for, and the silence they had praised as maturity. Would they finally call it fear? Or would they still have the nerve to call it gratitude? For the first few weeks after the portrait, I kept waiting for some dramatic sign that Lucy was beginning to feel safer. There wasn't one. No morning arrived when the blue duffel bag suddenly appeared empty beside the washing machine. She did not wake up argumentative, cover her walls in posters, demand expensive shoes, and become the kind of teenager television had promised me I should have been afraid of. The changes were so small that I might have missed them before. Then one Tuesday evening, Lucy told me no. I was standing at the stove trying to rescue chicken that had stayed in the oven longer than I intended. Lucy was at the kitchen table with her math book open, though she had spent more time drawing tiny windows along the edge of a worksheet than solving anything. I reminded her that she still needed to shower before bed and suggested she finish homework before starting another sketch. Normally, she would have closed the sketchbook immediately. Instead, without looking up, she said, "I don't want to do it right now." The words hung between us. Lucy's pencil stopped moving. Her head came up so quickly, I almost thought she had heard someone else say them. She started correcting herself before I could respond. She could do the homework now. She was sorry. She hadn't meant to sound rude. I turned back toward the stove because a smile had surprised me at exactly the wrong moment. Not because ignoring homework was funny. It wasn't. Not because I wanted her to disobey me. I didn't. I smiled because, for perhaps the first time since she came to live with me, my daughter had expressed an ordinary preference before checking whether I would approve of her having one. I scraped the overcooked edge off a piece of chicken and gave myself enough time to put my face back in order. Then I parented her. I told her she could finish the drawing first if she wanted, but homework still had to be done before she settled in for the night. She had enough time to choose the order. She did not have the option of skipping the assignment. Lucy stared at me. Nothing happened. No speech about how brave she had been to disagree. No hug. No reward. I went back to dinner. She watched me for several seconds longer before returning to the sketch. A few minutes later, she glanced toward the baking dish and said the chicken looked like it had survived. A small house fire. I lowered my head to hide another smile. "You're still eating it." She looked horrified by the injustice. That was all. A mother telling a teenager to do homework. A teenager insulting dinner. There are moments in a family that seem meaningless until you understand what came before them. For most parents, that exchange would barely deserve remembering. For me, it felt like someone had cracked a window. Lucy finished her drawing. Then she did the homework. At 9:30, she appeared in the living room holding the worksheet and explained she had gotten one problem wrong because the instructions were badly written. She had gotten the problem wrong because she had rushed. I told her so. She rolled her eyes. Then she froze. The expression disappeared so quickly it was almost painful. She apologized. I didn't tell her she was allowed to roll her eyes at me. That would have made the entire thing ridiculous. I simply told her to put the worksheet in her backpack before she forgot it. The next morning, it was still there. Life continued. That was what Lucy needed more than praise. She needed evidence that disagreement could be followed by Wednesday. The harder test came 2 days later. Dad's grocery visit had left one ordinary ceramic mug in my cabinet that had somehow become Lucy's favorite. It wasn't valuable. White with thin blue lines around the rim. I had bought a set of 6 years earlier, and by then only 3 matched because normal kitchens slowly consume dishes. Lucy liked that mug because the handle fit her fingers better than the heavier ones. Thursday morning, I heard it break. I was in the laundry room sorting clothes when something struck the kitchen floor, followed by a sharp crack and complete silence. By the time I reached the kitchen, Lucy was on her knees. The mug had broken into 4 large pieces and a scatter of smaller white chips across the tile. Coffee had spread beneath one cabinet. Lucy was already grabbing pieces with her bare hands. I stopped her before she cut herself and reached for the broom. She began apologizing. Not once, again and again. She had set it too close to the counter. Her sleeve caught it. She should have been paying attention. She could replace it. She had some money saved. Her breathing became too quick. The mug was worth maybe $4. Nothing about her reaction belonged to a $4 mug. I told her to move back while I swept the sharp pieces. She did, but her hands remained clasped tightly against her stomach. When I said I was annoyed about the mess because we were already running late, Lucy's face lost color. For one terrible second, I saw the calculation happen. Annoyed. Mistake. Cost. Too much. I put the broom against the counter. I did not tell her I wasn't annoyed. That would have been a lie, and I had started to understand that safety could not depend on pretending parents never had negative emotions. I was annoyed. There was coffee under the cabinet. We were late. My favorite sweatshirt had a brown spot across one cuff. All of that could be true without threatening the relationship. I told her the mug was a mug. She would help clean the floor properly when we got home. We were still leaving for school in 10 minutes. Nothing about the situation had anything to do with whether she belonged in the house. Lucy's eyes filled. She turned her face away as though the tears embarrassed her more than the broken mug. I finished sweeping. She cried quietly near the refrigerator. I did not turn the moment into a lecture about trauma. I handed her a paper towel for her face and told her to get her backpack. At school drop-off, she lingered in the passenger seat. Normally, she was out before the car fully settled into park. That morning, she watched me carefully. I told her I would be there at 3:30. She nodded. Then she got out. At 3:29, I was waiting in the pickup line. That afternoon, she got into the car and checked my face before putting on her seatbelt. I asked how school went. She told me her science teacher had assigned too much homework. We drove home. The broken mug was still broken. The relationship wasn't. We cleaned the coffee stain together. Lucy found a tiny ceramic chip I had missed beneath the refrigerator and made a face about my supposedly terrible sweeping skills. I told her she was welcome to become head of household floor inspection. She nearly apologized for the joke, then stopped. That mattered too. I began seeing that reassurance worked differently than I had imagined. My instinct was to tell her, again and again, that I would never leave. I had already told her, more than once. The sentence mattered, but repeating it every time Lucy became anxious risked turning reassurance into another ritual she needed in order to feel safe. I didn't want her to believe that our relationship existed only when I verbally renewed it, so I relied on boring things. Dinner happened. School pickup happened. Laundry happened. I asked whether she had brushed her teeth. I reminded her that dirty socks did not belong beneath the couch. When she forgot to put the trash out, the trash stayed her responsibility the next morning. When she became frustrated with me, I still knocked on her door later to say goodnight. I did not make every night emotionally meaningful. Some nights I was tired. Some nights Lucy barely looked up from her book. That was the point. Permanence was becoming ordinary. The duffel bag remained packed. I knew because once, while putting clean towels in her room, I saw the edge of it in the closet. I did not mention it. A few weeks earlier, the sight would have made me feel I had failed. Now I understood the bag had years behind it. I had weeks. I could not demand that fear lose simply because I finally understood the contest. Meanwhile, the rest of the family was becoming impatient. The Harper family had eaten Sunday supper together once a month for as long as I could remember. It was not elegant. Usually Dad grilled something if the weather cooperated. Mom made enough side dishes to feed twice our number. Valerie brought dessert because she distrusted everyone else's judgment about cake, and I arrived with whatever Mom claimed was missing. Sometimes Carol came. Sometimes another relative stopped by. Mostly it was simply routine. Dad loved it. When Valerie contacted me about the upcoming supper, she did not break the boundary by messaging Lucy. She came to me directly, which at least meant she had listened to that part. The message sounded almost generous. For Dad's sake, she thought everyone should come. No discussion of the portrait, no pressure on Lucy. Just dinner. Return to normal. I read it at work between helping 2 students locate a reserved textbook. For several minutes, I considered going. That surprised me. Part of me missed the ordinary version of my family. I missed Dad standing over the grill arguing with a thermometer. I missed Carol complaining that Mom owned too many serving bowls. I even missed Valerie arriving 15 minutes early and immediately reorganizing something nobody had asked her to touch. Conflict had consequences for me too. I had spent so much time protecting Lucy that I sometimes forgot I was also losing something. Not my family entirely, but the uncomplicated version of it. Then I imagined Lucy walking back through my parents' front door. She would see Mom, Valerie, the place where the photograph had happened. She would wonder whether she was supposed to hug them, whether refusing would be rude, whether saying yes would make me think she was fine, whether saying no would ruin Grandpa's dinner. She would spend the entire evening doing emotional math. That was not Sunday supper. That was an examination. I told Valerie we would not attend if the expectation was that Lucy had to be around her or Mom before she wanted to. I didn't say never. I didn't demand anyone cancel dinner. Dad could have Sunday supper. Valerie could go. Mom could host. Carol could eat enough potato salad for 3 people if she felt ambitious. Lucy did not owe them her presence to prove the family still existed. Valerie responded by calling me unforgiving. I did not answer the accusation. That became another change in me. The old Denise would have spent 20 minutes explaining that I was not unforgiving, that I believed in second chances, that I hoped things improved eventually, that I loved everyone, that boundaries were temporary if people behaved well enough. Instead, I repeated the condition. Lucy would not be pressured to attend. That was all. Mom chose a different pressure point. She called the following evening. I almost did not answer, but enough time had passed since our last conversation that I decided hearing her directly was better than making Dad carry another message. Mom did not spend much time defending the portrait this time. She talked about Dad. He was 76. None of us were getting younger. Family traditions did not last forever. There were only so many Sunday dinners left in anyone's life. She said I would regret wasting time keeping everyone apart over one conflict. That word regret found the exact place she intended. Parents age quietly until one day you begin counting. How many Christmases? How many birthdays? How many summers with Dad complaining about humidity while refusing to come inside? At 50, I could no longer tell myself my parents would simply be there indefinitely. Mom knew that. So did I. The image came immediately. Dad's empty chair someday, and me wondering whether I had sacrificed months with him because I refused one dinner. For several minutes after the call ended, I stood beside the kitchen window looking into the dark backyard. My certainty weakened. Not about what Mom and Valerie had done, about the cost of my response. That was the most dangerous kind of doubt, because it sounded compassionate. Maybe Lucy could handle one dinner if I stayed beside her. Maybe Dad deserved to have everyone together. Maybe avoiding the house gave the incident too much power. Maybe making exceptions was what mature adults did. I had almost convinced myself when Lucy came downstairs looking for a charger. She asked if I knew where Grandma's old spare cable had gone. The ordinary mention of Mom made something clear. If I changed the boundary, because Mom had successfully made me afraid of Dad's age, Lucy would not learn that families sometimes make compromises. She would learn that boundaries lasted until the people who disliked them became sad enough. She had spent years being taught exactly that lesson from the other direction. Other people's discomfort outranked hers. I was not going to teach it again under a kinder name. I told Mom the next day that Dad's age did matter to me. That was why I would spend time with him separately. Lucy could see him too if she wanted. Sunday supper did not become a moral obligation simply because Dad was 76. Mom said I was being cold. The word hurt. I let it. Not every accusation required correction. Dad called later, and for once his position made the decision easier without making it for me. He had heard what Mom was saying about Sunday dinner. He told me he did not want Lucy coming because somebody had convinced her she owed him attendance. I want her here when she wants to be here. That was enough. Carol was less gentle when she called about something unrelated, and Sunday supper came up. She listened to the situation, then said, "Family peace was a strange thing. If it always required the smallest person in the room to swallow the most." She moved on to complaining about the price of tomatoes before I had time to turn the line into wisdom. That was Carol. She rarely stayed around to admire her own point. Sunday supper happened without us. Dad texted me a photograph of the grill because apparently the meat had turned out unusually well, and he believed I needed visual proof. Lucy and I ate pasta at home. She took the last piece of garlic bread without asking, then complained that I had used too much garlic in the sauce. When I pointed out she had eaten 2 bowls, she said survival sometimes required sacrifice. Later, she left an empty water glass on the coffee table. I called her back downstairs to move it. Her first reaction was surprise that I had summoned her for something so ordinary. Her second was genuine teenage irritation. She carried the glass to the kitchen, without apologizing for being annoyed. I watched her go upstairs and let myself enjoy what that meant, without turning it into another lesson. A few days later, the subject of Grandma came up again. Not because I brought it up, Lucy did. We were in the car after school. She had spent most of the ride talking about an assignment she hated and a friend who wanted to change their group project topic for the 3rd time. The conversation drifted, then paused. Lucy asked whether Grandma had tried to talk to me. I said yes, but not about meeting her directly. Mom had begun telling Dad she wanted things repaired eventually. The word apology had been mentioned, though I had not received one. Lucy looked out the window. We drove nearly a mile before she spoke again. If Grandma says sorry, do I have to forgive her? I felt my hands settle more firmly around the steering wheel. There it was. Even forgiveness had become another possible test of goodness. Good children were grateful. Good children didn't make scenes. Good children didn't divide families. And, apparently, good grandchildren forgave on schedule. I told Lucy no. An apology did not create an obligation to restore a relationship before she felt safe. She could listen to an apology one day and still need distance. She could believe someone was sorry and still decide she did not want private time with them. She could forgive eventually. She could take a long time. She might define forgiveness differently than I did. None of those choices changed whether she was a good daughter. Lucy remained quiet. Then she asked if refusing forgiveness would make her mean. I told her boundaries and cruelty were not the same thing. That was as far as I took it. I did not ask her to decide how she felt about Grandma that afternoon. She was 13. Adults had already made her responsible for enough. When we reached home, she carried her backpack upstairs and left it directly in the middle of the hallway. I stepped around it once. 5 minutes later, I made her come move it. She groaned from her bedroom. A completely ordinary, irritated teenage sound traveled down the stairs. I stood there listening to it with absurd affection. Then I told her she had 30 seconds before I moved the backpack into her room myself and charged a delivery fee. She appeared at the top of the stairs looking skeptical. "You can't charge me to move my own stuff." I told her she was welcome to challenge the invoice. She rolled her eyes. This time she did not apologize. She moved the backpack. The bag in her closet remained packed. The walls remained mostly bare. Some fears had moved only inches. But Lucy was beginning to do something she had rarely done before. She was taking emotional risks, disagreeing, complaining, leaving a glass behind, being irritated with me, trusting that the next meal still existed. That changed what I wanted from the rest of my family. Earlier, I had thought the goal might be repair, an apology, an admission, some version of the Harper family finding its way back to Sunday supper without everyone staring at the empty place where trust used to be. Now I understood that returning to normal could not be the goal. Normal was where the damage had hidden. Normal was Mom saying gratitude while Lucy heard temporary. Normal was Valerie praising obedience while Lucy packed a bag. Normal was Dad not asking questions. Normal was me smoothing every conflict until nobody had to admit what it cost. I did not want normal back. I wanted something safer than normal. By then, I knew another conversation with Mom and Valerie was unavoidable. Not because Lucy needed an apology immediately. Not because I thought I could force either woman to understand. But because the family had reached a point where everyone was talking around the consequences, while still debating whether I had the right to create them. That had to stop. This time Lucy would not be there. She would not sit in my parents' living room while Valerie measured her reaction or Mom explained what she had intended. She would not show anyone the bag. She would not have to cry convincingly enough to prove harm. The adults had created the problem. The adults could face it. I told Lucy only that I planned to have another conversation with Grandma and Valerie. Her first question was whether she needed to come. I said no. The relief crossed her face before she could hide it. That alone confirmed the decision. I did not know whether Mom would apologize. I did not know whether Valerie was capable of admitting anything beyond poor wording. I no longer cared about extracting the perfect sentence from either of them. The next confrontation was not going to be about making them say sorry. It was going to be about making sure there was nowhere left to hide the meaning of what they had done. And this time, the child they had spent years teaching to make herself smaller would not have to stand in the room while I did it. By the time I agreed to meet Mom and Valerie again, I knew the purpose of the conversation. I was not going there to convince them Lucy was a good child, produce her messages one by one, or beg for an apology. Most of all, Lucy was not coming with me. That decision mattered enough that I told her twice. The morning of the meeting, she sat at the kitchen table eating cereal while I folded one sheet of paper into my purse. I had reduced everything to 3 facts because I knew what happened when Valerie had too many details to work with. She separated them, challenged one word, introduced a side issue, and before long, the original problem had dissolved into 20 smaller arguments. The photograph, the repeated reminders about gratitude, being difficult, and how much I had done for Lucy. The effect those reminders had produced, that was enough. Lucy watched me put the paper away and asked whether I needed her phone. I told her no. She asked if Grandma would want to see the messages. I said that did not matter. Her spoon stopped halfway to the bowl. I could tell she was trying to understand why evidence would not be necessary if there was going to be an argument about what happened. For the last several years, she had learned to think like someone whose right to object depended on proving the objection was serious enough. I sat across from her. I told her she was not coming because she was not evidence. She did not have to sit in a room and look hurt enough to make adults believe they had hurt her. She did not have to explain the bag. She did not have to defend why certain words frightened her. Whatever happened next belonged to the adults who had created the problem. Lucy looked relieved before she looked guilty about being relieved. That expression was becoming familiar. I reached across the table and pushed the cereal box toward her because she had eaten around most of the marshmallow pieces and left them floating in the milk. She looked at me suspiciously. "You know those are the best part." I told her I was aware and that her technique of pretending otherwise had failed. She ate one. Nothing about the moment was important to the confrontation ahead. That was why I treasured it. An hour later, I drove to my parents' house alone. Dad had asked to be there. I had considered meeting Valerie and Mom somewhere neutral, but after everything that had happened, I decided the location mattered less than who controlled the decision. Lucy would not be in the house. I could leave whenever I wanted. Dad lived there too, and the consequences of what Mom had done were already affecting his home whether I discussed them there or not. The last time I had walked through that front door with Lucy, she had been wearing the green blouse and the necklace she later tucked underneath the fabric. This time, I entered with only my purse. The living room had been put back exactly as it was before the anniversary portrait. The side table had returned to its usual place. The chair Mom moved for the photographer was back near the window. If I had not known better, I could have convinced myself nothing had happened there. Dad was sitting in one of the armchairs. Mom occupied the couch. Valerie stood by the window with her arms folded, then sat when I came in. Nobody had invited Carol. I was glad. This did not need witnesses. It needed honesty. I took the chair across from Mom and set my purse on the floor. For a few seconds, the room had the strange stillness of a place where everyone had rehearsed their own version of what would happen next. Valerie broke it first. She began with intent. That had become her safest territory. She had never told Lucy I would abandon her. She had never told her to pack a bag. She had never told anyone to take her out of my house. According to Valerie, everything I was accusing her of depended on taking ordinary advice and attaching the worst possible meaning to it afterward. I listened. Then I told her intent was not the first fact we were discussing. The first fact was what she had actually said. Get one without her. Don't get too comfortable. Kids who make scenes are hard to keep around. Valerie shifted immediately to context, explaining that the last comment came after Lucy talked about making a scene at school. I asked why a warning about school behavior had to be framed in terms of being kept. She looked toward Mom. Mom stepped in with the gratitude defense Lucy had been welcome to family events, helped with school, given stability, opportunities, and support. I asked the question none of that answered. Why did gratitude always come up when she wanted something, got angry, or made a mistake? Mom returned to the claim that I had been too soft from the beginning. I did not follow her into a debate about my parenting. I reminded them that the messages and comments clustered around ordinary childhood friction, asking for something, complaining, resisting, getting angry. Dad looked toward Valerie. His face had changed. The question he asked at the portrait, "What exactly have you been telling her?" had started as a reaction to one sentence. Now, 6 weeks later, he was finally seeing the answer as a system rather than a collection of comments. Valerie noticed too. She became more defensive. She said I had spent weeks reconstructing innocent conversations into some psychological campaign that had never existed. She said I was giving a 13-year-old's interpretation more authority than the adults who had actually been there. That sentence almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because the hierarchy underneath it was so clear. Adults meant one thing. Lucy heard another. Therefore, Lucy's experience was the error. I had lived inside that logic most of my life. Mom said something hurtful. I reacted. The discussion became whether I had reacted correctly. I was finished with that structure. I told Valerie I did not need to prove she had designed a campaign. I needed to know what happened, after the reminders. That was where her certainty had always betrayed her. I asked whether Lucy became quieter after them. Valerie said sometimes. Whether she stopped asking for things. Sometimes. Whether she apologized. Often. Whether she became easier to manage. Valerie frowned at the wording. Then she said yes, because children usually settled down after someone gave them perspective. Dad leaned forward. Mom glanced at him. I could almost feel the room dividing along a line nobody had wanted to name. On one side was what the adults had called success. On the other was what Lucy had been doing to achieve it. I opened my purse. For 1 second, Valerie watched my hands as if she expected me to pull out screenshots. I didn't. I left the paper where it was. I told them about the bag. Not as proof. As consequence. I described where Lucy kept it upright near the front of her closet, zipped, handles positioned where she could lift it quickly. I described what was inside without turning every object into a dramatic symbol. Clothes, underwear, toothbrush, charger, a book, a small favorite item, a photograph. Normal things, enough to leave. Dad's face went gray. I had told him about the bag before, but hearing it in that room, connected directly to what Mom and Valerie were defending, changed something in him. His hands closed around the arms of the chair. Mom looked at me with a kind of controlled disbelief. We didn't tell her to pack a bag. The sentence arrived exactly as I knew it would. I nodded. She was right. Nobody told Lucy to pack it. That was part of the horror. They had given her enough information that she did the rest herself. Valerie exhaled sharply. Then she took it too literally. I turned toward her. For a moment, I could hear the air conditioner running somewhere behind the wall. Too literally. As if the mistake belonged to Lucy for believing language aimed directly at her oldest fear. I did not argue about whether she had interpreted the words correctly. I asked a different question. Why did a child need repeated reminders about the conditional nature of home at all? Valerie started to answer, but Mom spoke over her, saying again that nobody had described the home as conditional. I looked at her. Every time they used the word choice, every time they reminded Lucy I had not been obligated to adopt her, every time they linked my patience to how grateful she behaved, they made the relationship conditional whether they used that word or not. Mom began to say adoption had been my choice, because that was simply a fact. Dad cut in for the first time. He asked whether being born had been Valerie's choice. Nobody answered. He did not turn it into a speech. He simply sat back again. The question stayed in the room. Valerie looked irritated now. The meeting had moved away from territory she could control. She had expected to debate whether her words were cruel. Instead, we were talking about results. I returned to the result instead of retelling every incident. When Lucy wanted something, became angry, or feared she had made trouble, the reminders were followed by the same retreat. She stopped asking, swallowed the anger, or apologized. At the portrait, she stepped out before anyone had to tell her directly. The sequence repeated itself. Normal child behavior, fear, compliance. Valerie's frustration rose because, from her point of view, I was describing a method that had worked and insisting the success was evidence against her. That contradiction finally broke through her restraint. Look at her, Denise. She stopped acting out. She never gives you trouble. It worked. The room went still. Valerie added only that Lucy had become easier after people stopped treating every feeling like an emergency. Less pushing, less demanding, fewer problems. Mom interrupted her. Not to reject the method, but to say Valerie could have phrased it better. Dad looked at Mom. Whatever distinction he had still been searching for between Valerie's methods and Mom's intentions disappeared in that moment. I reached down and took the folded paper from my purse, but I did not open it. I no longer needed the notes. I told them what would happen next. The boundary I had already put in place was no longer temporary, while I figured things out. Neither Mom nor Valerie would have unsupervised access to Lucy. No private calls, no private messages, no rides, no picking her up from school, no stopping by my house to catch her alone, no using Dad or another relative to invite her to family events after I had already said no. If things changed someday, that would depend on actual acknowledgement of what had happened and on Lucy's comfort. Not on a deadline, not on whether Mom was lonely, not on whether Valerie believed enough time had passed. Valerie's expression hardened. She accused me of weaponizing Lucy. I had expected the phrase. It did not move me the way it would have once. I told her a consequence was not the same thing as a weapon. They had been given private access to my daughter because I trusted them. They used that access to say things I had never authorized and would never have allowed if I had heard them. Losing the access was a consequence of how they used it. That was all. Mom leaned forward. She said I could not keep family relationships frozen forever because I was angry. I told her the boundary did not depend on anger. That was important enough that I said it slowly. I did not need to remain furious in order to protect Lucy. I did not need to hate them. I did not need to punish them. They could be people I loved and people I did not trust alone with my child. Both things could exist at once. Mom looked wounded. For years, that expression alone had been enough to make me change course. I felt the old reflex anyway. Explain more. Soften it. Tell her I still loved her. Promise Sunday supper would return soon. Offer a timeline. The impulse rose so automatically that I almost mistook it for compassion. Then I remembered Lucy, asking whether Grandma would hate her. I remembered the bag. I let Mom be hurt. Valerie stood and began pacing near the window. She said Lucy would interpret the cutoff as proof that families broke because of her. She said I was causing exactly what I claimed to be preventing. For one brief second, the argument landed. Then I saw the trick in it. Valerie had spent years telling Lucy family conflict was her fault. Now she was using Lucy's fear of conflict as the reason I should avoid consequences for the people who created it. There would never be a safe moment to set a boundary if the boundary itself could always be blamed on the child. I told her Lucy was not responsible for the consequences of adult behavior. I was. They were. That was the whole point. Dad had been quiet for several minutes. Mom turned toward him. The movement was familiar enough that I recognized it instantly. For most of my life, when Mom decided a disagreement had gone far enough, she looked to Dad, not always consciously. He was the person who could say, everyone needed to calm down, that both sides had made their point, that family mattered more than being right. He had ended dozens of arguments that way. Mom looked at him now with the same expectation. Raymond? Only his name. It carried the request. Enough. Bring Denise back into line. Dad rested his elbows on his knees and looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Mom. I won't ask her to bring Lucy back into this house, just so we can pretend nothing happened. He did not raise his voice. That made the sentence stronger. Mom stared at him. Valerie stopped pacing. Dad continued only long enough to make his own boundary clear. If I wanted to visit him separately, I would. If Lucy wanted to see him, he would be grateful. But he would not use his age, the monthly dinner, or his relationship with me to pressure Lucy into a room where she did not feel safe. Then he mentioned the photograph. The photographer had not sent the final proofs yet, but Dad knew there would be one frame without Lucy because we had all heard the shutter click. He said that photograph would not be hanging in his house. Mom's face changed. Of everything said that afternoon, that may have been the consequence she understood most immediately. The portrait had begun as presentation, control over what the family looked like, a version she would not have to explain. Now, Dad was telling her the version created by excluding Lucy would never become the family image. He did not order Mom to agree. He did not claim the house belonged only to him. He simply said he would not participate in displaying it. Mom looked less angry than unsettled. Her assumptions were shifting underneath her. She had assumed Dad's silence was neutrality. It had functioned as support. Now it was gone. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. I had imagined this confrontation in pieces for weeks. In some versions, Valerie apologized. In others, Mom finally understood. In the angriest versions, I delivered some perfect sentence that left both of them speechless and made every year of peacekeeping feel redeemed. Reality was quieter. Valerie still thought fear had improved Lucy. Mom still believed gratitude had been a legitimate goal. Neither woman gave me an apology I would have trusted. Nothing about the room felt victorious. But something important had changed. I no longer needed victory. I stood and picked up my purse. Mom asked if I was really leaving things like this. The old me might have stayed another hour just because the ending felt unfinished. I looked around the living room. Same chair, same window, same wall where the anniversary portrait was supposed to celebrate family permanence. I told her there was nothing more I needed to decide that day. The boundary was set. What happened next depended on what they did with the truth, not how well they argued against it. Dad walked me to the door. He did not apologize for Mom on the way. He did not ask whether I would call her tomorrow. He touched my shoulder once and told me to let him know I got home safely. That was all. Outside, the afternoon had cooled. The heat that had hung over central Ohio through August was finally beginning to loosen, and a faint breeze moved the leaves along the curb. I sat in my car for a minute before starting. After the first confrontation with Valerie, I had shaken in the parking lot. After Mom's calls, I had replayed every sentence and wondered whether I had been too harsh. That afternoon, there was no perfect apology behind me, no reconciliation, no family hug. Just 4 adults in a room, finally forced to look at the same set of facts. Lucy had been afraid. Fear had made her compliant. Valerie had noticed the compliance and continued. Mom had approved the reminders because she liked the result. They still preferred words like gratitude and discipline, but I no longer needed them to use my vocabulary before I trusted what I could see. On the drive home, I thought about Lucy asking whether an apology would require forgiveness. I had told her no. Now I understood that answer applied to me too. Accountability did not begin when the person who caused harm agreed with the boundary. Sometimes accountability began when agreement stopped mattering. When I pulled into the driveway, Lucy was sitting on the front steps with her sketchbook beside her. She stood as I got out of the car. Her eyes went straight to my face. For half a second, I saw the old habit. Read the adult. Predict the outcome. Prepare. I walked toward her and told her the conversation was over. She asked whether Grandma was mad. I said probably. Whether Valerie was mad. Definitely. Lucy's mouth tightened. I could see the next question forming. Was it because of her? I answered before she had to ask. Nothing that happened in that room was her job to fix. Lucy looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. She picked up the sketchbook and followed me inside. At the doorway, she kicked off her shoes. One landed neatly beside the wall. The other rolled onto its side, in the middle of the entryway. Lucy looked at it, then at me. A few weeks earlier, she would have corrected it immediately. This time, she left it there and went toward the kitchen. I stared at the shoe for a second. Then I stepped over it. The family I had spent 50 years trying to keep peaceful was no longer peaceful. Mom was angry. Valerie thought I was cruel. Dad had stopped protecting the old arrangement. Sunday dinners would not look the same. I did not know what would eventually be rebuilt. But for the first time in my life, I could live with the fact that other people believed my boundary was unreasonable. I did not need their permission to keep it. And Lucy no longer had to earn the right to stay while they decided whether I was allowed to protect her. The morning after I left my parents' house, I made coffee and found Lucy standing in front of the refrigerator, deciding whether eating the last yogurt counted as taking something somebody else might want. The confrontation was over, but the family system around it was not. Valerie had spent years as the default organizer, the person who knew who was coming to dinner, who needed a ride, and what everyone else had supposedly decided. I removed Lucy from group threads Valerie could use to pressure her, and stepped out of channels that had become extensions of that role. If relatives wanted to invite me somewhere, they could contact me directly. Some did. A cousin who normally asked Valerie whether I was attending something texted me herself. Another relative called Dad. Others avoided the subject because they did not know what to say. Nobody had to become a hero for the structure to change. Valerie simply stopped speaking for everyone by default. She noticed. One message accused me of dividing family conversations. I answered only that anything concerning Lucy came through me, and that adults could handle their own logistics. After that, people who wanted my version had to ask me for it. Some still thought I was overreacting. Some did not know enough to decide. I could live with that. Dad stopped asking me when I planned to return to my parents' house. He also stopped pretending the tension in his marriage would disappear if he gave Mom enough time to cool down. I only knew what he told me. I did not know what their evenings looked like when I wasn't there. I did not know which arguments happened behind closed doors, or whether Mom cried when nobody else could see her. I had learned enough about first-person assumptions in my own life to stop inventing scenes just because I could imagine them. Dad told me the parts that involved me. He had told Mom that if she wanted any future relationship with Lucy to be considered, she had to stop speaking about her, as though she were a guest who had received unusually generous accommodations. He had also asked Mom to consider counseling with him. The word surprised me. Dad came from a generation of men who could repair a lawnmower with no instructions, but sometimes treated emotional conversations like unexploded devices. Hearing him say he had asked for counseling told me more about the state of their marriage than any dramatic description could have. He did not say he was leaving Mom. He did not threaten divorce. He said there was distance between them that had not existed before, because he could no longer pretend her view of Lucy was merely old-fashioned, once he understood what that view had done. Mom did not appreciate him describing it that way. I knew that because she told me herself during one brief phone call. She accused Dad of letting one family disagreement redefine decades of marriage. I almost corrected her. Then I stopped. If she still believed the issue was one disagreement, another explanation from me was not going to fix that. What Mom lost first was not her marriage. It was certainty. She had always assumed that if she hosted something, I would eventually come. If Dad had a birthday, I would come. If there was Sunday dinner, I would come. If she called enough times, I would answer. If she was hurt enough, I would soften. She had treated family attendance almost like gravity. Now she had to ask. And sometimes the answer was no. That change was quiet enough that nobody outside the family would have recognized it as a consequence. Mom recognized it. A week or so after the confrontation, the photographer sent the anniversary proofs. I had nearly forgotten they were coming. Dad forwarded the gallery to me with no message attached. For several minutes, I did not open it. The last time I had thought about those photographs in detail, all I could hear was the shutter that clicked after Lucy stepped out. Eventually, I sat at my desk after work, waited until the library office had emptied, and opened the link. There were dozens of images. Dad and Mom alone. Dad pretending he hated having his picture taken. Mom trying not to laugh at him. Valerie adjusting her hair. Different combinations of the family. Then I reached the full group shots from before everything went wrong. Lucy was there. In one, she stood beside Dad, with her green blouse catching the late afternoon light. Dad's tie was slightly crooked even after she had fixed it. Mom's posture was perfect. Valerie looked toward the camera. I was standing close enough to Lucy that our arms touched. Lucy was not centered. Nobody had arranged the picture around her. That was what made it beautiful. She was simply there. Part of the frame. Exactly the thing my mother had somehow decided required explanation. I moved through several nearly identical shots. Then I found the other one. The single frame after Lucy stepped out. The photographer had captured it before he understood what was happening. I knew that from memory, but seeing the proof was different. Everyone remained almost exactly where they had been, except for one empty space. It was not a large opening. A person unfamiliar with us might not even have noticed. I did. Dad's expression had not yet changed. Mom was still positioned toward the camera. Valerie stood slightly angled, her face caught between the organizing smile she had worn all afternoon and whatever came next. Lucy was not there. The photograph looked cleaner in exactly the way Mom had wanted. It also looked wrong. I did not save it. I closed the gallery. Later that evening, Dad called. He had looked through the proofs too. He did not ask me which one I thought he should choose. He told me he had already decided he would not purchase the No Lucy version. If he ordered an anniversary portrait for the house, he would choose one of the earlier frames where Lucy was included. No announcement. No symbolic ceremony. No plan to show Mom's friends both pictures and explain what she had done. The photograph that excluded Lucy simply would not become the photograph representing the family. That consequence suited the harm better than any public humiliation could have. Mom had wanted a family image she would not have to explain. Now the version created for that purpose was the one Dad refused to display. A few days later, when I told Lucy Grandpa had chosen a full family picture, she looked at me carefully. She asked whether Grandma had agreed. I said I didn't know. Lucy seemed to wait for more. I didn't give her more. Grandma's approval did not determine whether Lucy belonged in the photograph. That was another lesson I wanted to become boring. Around the same time, Carol began noticing the way other relatives talked about what happened. Not everyone had known what to say when the portrait incident first spread through the family. One relative admitted exactly that during a small gathering I attended without Lucy. She said she had heard several versions and stayed quiet because she did not want to make things worse. Carol, who had spent her entire life allergic to language that excused passivity, looked across the table and said, "Not knowing what to say was different from deciding to say nothing forever." Then she reached for the salad. She did not turn the moment into a lecture. That was why it landed. Nobody suddenly confessed to years of moral failure. But something changed afterward. A comment about Lucy being lucky came up weeks later in a conversation with someone who clearly meant no harm. Before I could respond, another relative said that maybe lucky was not the word we needed to keep using around a child who already worried she owed the family for being allowed into it. The comment was not perfect. It did not need to be. The important part was that the old language no longer passed through the room untouched. People heard it now. Dad's new role in family logistics provided one unexpected benefit: comedy. Without Valerie coordinating everything, he decided he could handle the next Sunday supper himself. He sent a group message, saying dinner would be at 5. 10 minutes later, he sent another saying 6. Then a third explaining he had meant 5:30 all along. Carol responded that the family had apparently discovered logistics did not require a dictator, only someone who knew how to use a calendar. Dad replied with an emoji he almost certainly had not intended to send. Lucy saw the message, because Dad forwarded it to me, and she laughed so hard at the accidental dancing pineapple that she had to put her drink down. It was a ridiculous moment. I held on to it. Not every consequence needed to feel grim. Sometimes the disappearance of a controlling role revealed that other people could figure things out badly, laugh, and survive. Valerie did not disappear from the family. That would have been unrealistic. She still saw Mom. She still spoke to Dad. She still attended events I did not attend. But she no longer automatically represented me, scheduled Lucy, or delivered family expectations through private contact. Her place changed because access changed. Mom's did too. I kept the practical boundaries documented. The messages stayed saved, the restrictions remained in writing, and the school pickup and emergency contact changes stayed in place. Valerie and Mom respected those limits. so there was no need for anything beyond the authority I already had as Lucy's mother. The harder work happened inside my house. Lucy did not believe the boundary immediately. Not really. She believed I was enforcing it. That was different. Several days after the confrontation, Lucy asked whether I was still mad at Grandma. A week later, she asked again, after my anger had visibly cooled. That was when I understood what she was testing, whether the boundary existed only while I was furious. While we unloaded groceries, she finally asked whether Grandma would be allowed to pick her up again once I was not mad anymore. I told her the rule had never been about maintaining anger. It existed because private access had been used in a way that was not safe for her. When she asked versions of the same question later, my answer stayed the same. Ordinary life kept supplying the rest of the evidence. She argued about bedtime, complained about chores, left a hoodie on the floor, and sometimes heard no when she wanted something. I remained her mother through all of it. By then, I no longer needed to narrate every small test to myself. The important change was that Lucy was beginning to notice the answer did not vary with my mood. The bag, however, stayed packed in the closet. Weeks passed. The season shifted slowly. Mornings became cooler. The light disappeared earlier. Dad visited Lucy separately a few times, usually at my house or somewhere she chose. He never used the visits to deliver messages from Mom. Once, after he left, Lucy asked whether Grandma was lonely. I said she probably was. Lucy looked down at her hands. I knew where her mind was going. Lonely adult, unhappy family. Lucy as cause. I told her loneliness could be real without becoming her responsibility. She absorbed the sentence quietly. Dad also told me carefully that Mom had agreed to attend counseling with him. He did not present that as redemption. Neither did I. Going to counseling was an action. It was not an apology. It was not repaired trust. It was not permission to resume private contact. Still, it was the first sign Mom might eventually become willing to examine something instead of defend it. Valerie remained more resistant. She sent one message through me saying she was sorry. Things had gotten so out of hand, and that she never intended for Lucy to feel unwanted. I read it once, then saved it with the others. There was nothing malicious in the apology. There was also no acknowledgement of what Valerie had actually done. She was sorry about the result. She still did not name the method, so nothing changed. That was another lesson I had to learn. Not every apology required an immediate response. Not every attempt at repair earned restored access. A person could be moving 1 inch in the right direction and still be 99 inches from trust. By then, enough time had passed that the family stopped waiting for my anger to burn itself out. Over the following several weeks, people stopped waiting for normal to restore itself. Relatives contacted me directly. Dad handled his own dinners. Carol attended some things and skipped others. I saw Dad without Mom, and Lucy saw Grandpa without having to walk back into the house where the portrait happened. Nobody liked every part of the new arrangement, but it functioned without requiring Lucy to absorb the discomfort. One afternoon, Dad stopped by with an envelope. Inside was a small print of the anniversary photograph he had chosen. Not the formal version, where everyone looked perfectly arranged. A slightly earlier frame. Dad's tie was crooked. Mom was looking toward him instead of directly at the camera. Valerie's posture was not quite ready. Lucy had the beginning of a smile because Dad had just said something under his breath. I stood beside her. It was imperfect. Alive. Dad said that was the one he was keeping. Lucy held it by the edges. She did not say much. Neither did I. There was no need to explain why the photograph mattered. The girl who had stepped out of the frame was visible in the picture that stayed. Dad left after coffee. Lucy put the print on the kitchen counter. Later I noticed she had taken it upstairs. I did not ask where she put it. That night, while checking whether her window was closed before rain came in, I saw the picture leaning beside the other frame on her dresser. Still not hung, but there, I counted that as exactly what it was. A small movement, not a miracle. By then, nearly every visible part of our life had changed more than the duffel bag. The school list had changed. Family routines had changed. Dad had changed. My relationship with Mom had changed. The way I responded to Valerie had changed. Lucy had changed enough to leave dishes around and criticize my cooking with growing confidence. The bag did not. One evening, I went into her room to leave clean towels on the chair. Lucy was downstairs finishing a snack. The closet door stood open. The blue duffel sat inside. Still zipped, still packed. My stomach tightened with the old disappointment. For one brief second, I wanted to see it as a verdict. After all this, she still thinks she might leave. Then I stopped myself. That interpretation would make the bag about me. Lucy had spent years learning to keep it ready. I had only recently begun giving her different evidence. Healing was not an assignment she owed me for finally doing my job correctly, so I left the towels. I closed nothing. I said nothing. The bag remained where it was. Several more days passed. Then, one night, after dinner, I was on the couch with a book open on my lap when I heard something bump against the upstairs wall. A zipper. Then, footsteps. Heavy enough that whoever was coming down was carrying something. I looked toward the staircase. Lucy appeared at the top. The blue duffel was in her hand. Every muscle in my body tightened before I could stop it. For weeks, I had trained myself not to interpret everything through fear. That night, I failed immediately. The bag was packed. Lucy was carrying it downstairs. My mind jumped ahead so fast I barely heard her steps. Had I pushed too hard? Had she decided she wanted space? Was she going to ask to stay with Dad? Had something happened that I had missed? She reached the bottom. The bag brushed against the railing. I stood. Lucy looked at me. I could not read her expression. That frightened me more. She crossed the living room, not toward the front door, toward me. Then she lowered the duffel onto the rug between the couch and the coffee table. The same handles she had once arranged, so she could leave quickly, fell sideways against the fabric. Lucy sat on the floor beside it. Her fingers rested on the zipper. She looked up at me. "Can we go through this together?" For a second, I could not speak. Not because the bag was finally open. It wasn't. Not because she had decided everything inside no longer mattered. She hadn't. But for the first time since I learned that bag existed, Lucy had carried it out of her room without carrying it toward an exit. She had brought it to me. Lucy kept one hand on the zipper and waited. Nearly 3 months had passed since the anniversary portrait. Long enough for late August heat to give way to cooler mornings. Long enough for the family crisis to stop feeling like the first thing waiting for me when I opened my eyes. But not long enough for anything about Lucy's fear to feel finished. I moved from the couch to the rug and sat across from her. I did not tell her how proud I was. I did not announce that this was a big step. The quickest way to make the bag feel like another performance would have been to turn opening it into a ceremony. Lucy had carried enough meaning for adults already, so I asked where she wanted to start. She pulled the zipper. The contents looked almost exactly as they had the first time she showed them to me. Clothes, underwear, and socks, the sealed toothbrush, charger, paperback, keychain, and the photograph of the two of us, squinting beside Lake Erie. What had changed was not what was inside, but why we were looking at it. Lucy took out the shirts first. One no longer fit well because she had grown since she packed it. Another went back toward her dresser. We worked that way. One item at a time, with every decision hers. The toothbrush made her pause. It was still sealed inside the sandwich bag. She remembered one foster home where several children shared a bathroom, and she could never remember which drawer was supposed to be hers, so keeping a toothbrush with her belongings had felt safer. She said it matter-of-factly. I listened. When she was ready, she opened the bag and carried the spare toothbrush to the trash. The charger went into her desk after she laughed at herself for having spent 20 minutes looking for one the week before, while an emergency spare sat packed downstairs. The paperback took longer. She had carried it through 3 homes because it fit into almost anything and nobody had ever asked for it back. She was not ready to put it on the regular bookshelf, so she chose her nightstand instead. The photograph came out last. Dad had taken it during our first summer together, before the adoption was finalized, and managed to put the sun directly in our eyes. Lucy looked at it and said, "I looked terrified of sunlight." I told her she still did. She gave me the kind of mildly offended look I had once been warned teenagers specialized in, then carried the photograph upstairs and returned with a small hammer. For years, that picture had leaned against a wall. This time Lucy chose a place beside her desk. We put in a nail together, argued briefly over whether the picture was crooked or the wall was, and left a tiny hole I would someday have to patch if she moved it. Downstairs, the duffel sat open and empty. Lucy did not throw it away, and I did not suggest she should. We folded it loosely and put it with the ordinary luggage in the hall closet, underneath an old suitcase, and beside the tote I used for weekend trips. It was still the same bag. It simply no longer had to stay packed. For several days after that, nothing else happened. That was another thing I had learned to appreciate. Important changes did not always announce themselves immediately. Then Lucy asked if she could paint her room. Not the whole room. One wall. She approached the subject on a Saturday morning while I was sorting mail at the kitchen counter. She had apparently been thinking about it long enough to know approximately how much paint we would need and which wall she wanted. The request was unnecessary. That was what made it matter. A functioning bedroom did not require paint. Her gray walls were clean. A colored wall would not improve her grades, make her safer, or solve any practical problem. She wanted it because she wanted it. For Lucy, that was becoming its own category. We went to the hardware store that afternoon. I made the mistake of pointing toward a warm beige sample. Lucy stared at it, as though I had suggested covering the wall in wet cardboard. "Mom, beige is what apartments use when they've given up." I defended beige, on behalf of reasonable adults, everywhere. She informed me reasonable adults were apparently the reason paint stores needed entire aisles of colors nobody chose. 10 minutes later, we were standing beneath fluorescent lights debating between 2 shades of muted blue that looked almost identical to me and completely different to her. I picked the wrong one twice. Lucy finally took both cards outside toward the natural light, because, according to her, I was not helping. I followed her, carrying the paint tray. A few months earlier, hearing that tone from her would have stopped me cold, because Lucy almost never risked sounding irritated. Now I let myself enjoy it. She was 13. Her mother had bad opinions about paint, the world continued. We chose the darker blue, not because I liked it more, because it was her wall. I still made her look at the price. We calculated what we needed, skipped the more expensive brand, and agreed to paint the following weekend because we had other things to do. No surprise bedroom makeover, no spending spree to prove she belonged. Families have budgets. Permanence includes waiting until Saturday. The next test came before the paint did. Lucy brought home a bad science grade she had hidden in the bottom of her backpack. The grade itself was fixable. What mattered was that, for once, she had behaved like a teenager who hoped her mother would not find out. I did. I was annoyed, and she was annoyed that I was annoyed. We argued about the missing work. I told her hiding it was worse than the grade, and her phone privileges changed for the weekend until she completed what she had skipped. Lucy thought that was unfair and went upstairs angry enough to close her door harder than necessary. Months earlier, I might have followed to reassure her before fear filled the silence. This time I made dinner. She came down still irritated, ate with me, did the dishes because it was her turn, and said goodnight without pretending we had not argued. A few days later, she finished the assignment, got her phone back, and moved on to complaining about laundry. Meanwhile, the distance between our house and the rest of the Harper family stayed where I had put it, time softened my anger. It did not soften the boundary. Valerie made one more attempt at apology through me. The wording had improved slightly since the first one. She admitted she had been too harsh, and said she regretted making Lucy feel unwelcome. But she still treated the harm as a communication failure. She did not acknowledge that she had deliberately repeated the reminders because Lucy became more compliant afterward. I did not punish her for failing to produce the correct sentence. I simply did not restore the access. She no longer picked Lucy up. She no longer texted privately. She no longer organized my participation in family gatherings. Other relatives had adjusted. The family did not collapse. Sunday supper happened when people wanted it to happen. Sometimes, Dad organized it badly. Sometimes, Carol rescued the schedule. Sometimes, I saw Dad separately. Valerie was still my sister. That was true. She was also no longer someone I trusted alone with my daughter. That was true too. I had spent much of my life assuming love required one truth to erase the other. It didn't. Mom changed differently. Dad continued counseling with her, and after several weeks, he told me she had finally begun describing what happened without immediately adding the word "but." That was his observation, not mine. I remained cautious. Then Mom asked if she could meet me alone. Not Lucy. Me. I agreed to coffee. We met at a quiet place in the middle of the week, almost exactly the kind of neutral setting where I had confronted Valerie months earlier. Mom looked older to me. I don't mean she had dramatically aged in 12 weeks. She was still Judith, still carefully dressed, still the woman who could straighten a sugar packet without noticing she was doing it. But certainty had always made her seem harder. That day, she had less of it. She did not ask when Lucy would visit. That mattered. She did not remind me Dad was 76. She did not mention Sunday dinner. For several minutes, she talked about counseling in broad terms. She said hearing Dad describe Lucy as having been treated like a guest had made her angry at first. She had thought he was exaggerating. Over time, she had been forced to look at how often her language separated what I had done for Lucy from what other parents simply did for their children. I listened. I did not help her get to the point. Eventually, Mom placed both hands around her cup and said the first thing in months that sounded like accountability instead of improved defense. I made her believe your love had conditions because I thought fear would make her grateful. The sentence hurt in a new way. Not because I had never understood it. Because she finally did. At least enough to say it. Mom's eyes dropped toward the table. I did not rush across the space between us. I did not tell her everything was forgiven. I did not promise she would see Lucy next weekend. Acknowledgement was not a ticket back into my daughter's life. It was the first requirement for ever discussing the road. I told Mom I appreciated that she had finally named what happened. I also told her nothing changed that day. No private access, no pressure on Lucy. If Lucy ever wanted contact, we would move at Lucy's comfort and at a pace that did not require her to reward Mom for becoming more self-aware. Mom's mouth tightened slightly. I saw the old Judith react. Then she let the reaction pass. She nodded. That was another small difference. When I got home, I did not tell Lucy what Grandma had said. Not immediately. Mom's progress did not become another responsibility for Lucy to evaluate. When the subject came up days later, I told her Grandma was working on understanding what she had done. Lucy asked whether that meant she had to see her. I said no. She nodded and returned to drawing. That answer still mattered more than Mom's confession. Dad remained the easiest relationship to repair because he had stopped trying to use it as a bridge. He came to our house. Sometimes Lucy went out for lunch with him. Eventually, she agreed to visit my parents' house one afternoon while Mom was out, because she wanted to help Dad with a computer problem he had somehow made worse by following online instructions. I drove her. The house looked different without the pressure of a family gathering. The anniversary portrait Dad had chosen was hanging in the hallway. I noticed it before Lucy did. It was the imperfect frame from the proofs. Dad's tie slightly crooked. Mom looking toward him. Valerie not quite ready. Me beside Lucy. Lucy smiling because something had happened just before the shutter. The No Lucy photograph was nowhere. Dad did not point this out. Neither did I. Lucy eventually saw the picture on her way back from the kitchen. She stopped. Dad kept pretending to investigate why his printer believed it lived in another state. Lucy stood in front of the photograph for several seconds. Then she asked whether Grandpa really planned to keep that one even though his tie looked terrible. Dad blamed her for failing to fix it properly. Lucy reminded him she had fixed it twice, and the tie apparently had personal goals. Dad told her that sounded disrespectful. She smiled. He smiled. No one discussed symbolism. That was how I wanted it. The picture stayed because Lucy belonged in it, not because the family needed a monument to what had happened. A few days later, we painted her wall. The blue was darker on the wall than it had looked on the sample. I mentioned this once. Lucy informed me this was why nobody had trusted me with the final decision. We moved her desk away from the wall, spread plastic across the floor, and got paint on places neither of us had intended. Lucy painted one section badly enough that I had to go over it. I painted another section badly enough that she took the roller away from me. When we were finished, we stood in the doorway staring at the wet blue wall. Her lake photograph had temporarily moved to the dresser. The shelf we had chosen was still in its box. The next morning, after the paint dried, we installed it. The screws went directly into the wall, permanent enough to require tools if she ever wanted it gone. Lucy placed books on it, then moved them, then added a small plant she would almost certainly forget to water. The empty duffel bag remained in the hall closet downstairs. Not hidden, not ready, just luggage. That evening I passed Lucy's doorway and saw the normal wreckage of a project finished by a 13-year-old. Paint cards on the floor, a sweatshirt on the chair instead of inside it, 2 books stacked crookedly on the new shelf, her backpack open near the desk. I almost reminded her to clean up. Then I did remind her. Permanence did not exempt anyone from picking up after themselves. Lucy complained that she had spent the entire weekend working on my room and deserved a day off. I stopped in the hallway. My room. She did not notice she had said it. I did. I let the words pass without making them heavy. I told her she could have until tomorrow. She negotiated for the day after. We settled on tomorrow evening. Then, while she rearranged the books on the new shelf, Lucy asked whether we could do something during winter break. There was an art exhibit she had heard about in Columbus that would run for several months. She thought we could go after Christmas, maybe invite Grandpa if he wanted. She spoke while looking at the shelf. No hesitation. No qualifier. No if you still want me here. No if things are okay by then. No if I'm not too expensive. She simply placed herself months into the future and assumed the house, the room, and I would still exist around her. I leaned against the doorframe. The blue paint behind her was dry. A tiny spot near the baseboard was lighter because we had missed it. The photograph by the lake hung beside her desk again. The shelf was attached firmly enough that removing it someday would leave holes. Lucy kept talking about the exhibit. I listened. Fear had not disappeared from her, and I knew better than to give our story that kind of ending. There would still be mistakes, arguments, old memories, and moments when she checked my face before deciding whether she was allowed to want something. Healing meant those instincts no longer had the only vote. Lucy was beginning to have enough ordinary experience anger, followed by dinner, boundaries that held, a photograph that included her, a room she had marked as her own to answer the old fear when it returned. Lucy turned from the shelf and asked whether winter break was too far ahead to plan. I told her no. We had plenty of time. She smiled and began telling me which weekend would work best. And for the first time since she became my daughter, I noticed what was missing from the way she talked about the future. She was not preparing for the day I might stop wanting her. She was making plans for the months ahead because she believed she would still be here. Home was finally becoming what I had wanted it to be from the beginning. Not something Lucy earned by being good. Not something she rented with gratitude. Not something she had to wake up every morning and deserve again. Just home.